I still have nightmares about what happened. They aren't ordinary dreams, the kind where you fall from a tall building or are chased by shapeless shadows in an endless forest. They are memories, fragments so vivid that when I wake up, I can still smell the sweet smoke of the beeswax candles burning in the basement, feel the cold of the rough concrete floor beneath my bare knees, hear the hoarse whispers of voices repeating "it's for the good of the circle" like a hypnotic mantra, and above all, hear the cries. The cries that didn't dare to become screams because they knew that screaming would only bring more pain, more punishment, more darkness. Those cries wake me up sweating, my heart pounding like a runaway drum in my chest, and leave me staring at the ceiling of my room for hours, wondering if I will ever be able to sleep without those images seeping into my dreams like black ink in clear water. My name is Yara. I was 22 when I entered the Golden Light. I thought it was a refuge, a place of healing, an oasis amid the chaos of my life in Portland, Oregon. I had lost my mother a year earlier in a car accident that occurred on a road made slippery by the constant rain of the northwest coast, a head-on collision with a cargo truck that killed her instantly and left my father broken, drinking more than he should in his lonely house on the outskirts of town. My boyfriend of 3 years, a guy named Ethan, who worked at a tech startup and always talked about changing the world with eco-friendly delivery apps, had left me with a note stuck to the refrigerator that said, "I can't take your constant sadness anymore. I need space to grow." The note was written on a yellow Post-it in his slanted, hurried handwriting, as if he hadn't even had time for a face-to-face conversation. And my job as an assistant at a veterinary clinic in downtown Portland left me exhausted, empty, meaningless. I spent 8 hours a day cleaning cages of anxious dogs, administering vaccines to cats that scratched my arms with sharp claws, and comforting tearful owners when their pets didn't survive surgery. The smell of disinfectant and animal hair clung to my clothes, and at the end of the day, I would return to my small apartment in an old apartment building in the Nob Hill neighborhood, where thin walls let in the arguments of neighbors and the constant traffic on Burnside Street hummed like an eternal reminder that life was moving on without me. Portland was a city I loved and hated in equal measure. I loved its independent cafes with fern leaf latte art and tattooed baristas who discussed indie literature while preparing your order, its weekend markets with organic food stalls and handmade crafts, its green parks like Forest Park, where I could walk for hours among century-old trees and forget the urban noise. But I hated the endless rain that fell 9 months of the year, turning the streets into gray rivers and the sky into an oppressive blanket of clouds, the gentrification that had displaced so many friends to distant suburbs, and the loneliness that felt more acute in a city full of people who were connected but emotionally disconnected. My friends were busy with their lives, marriages, children, careers that absorbed them. I was the eternal single woman, the one who always said yes to last-minute invitations but rarely received one in return. Then one day, at a downtown cafe called Brewed Awakening, a place with exposed brick walls, recycled wood tables, and a menu of specialty coffees with names like Foggy Morning Latte and Rainy Day Espresso, a woman sat down across from me without asking permission. "I see you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," she said, in a soft, almost musical voice that contrasted with the hubbub of the cafe filled with open laptops and conversations about startups. She was tall with an upright posture that made her seem more imposing than her thinness suggested, with silver hair pulled back into a low bun and loose strands framing her angular face, with deep green eyes that seemed to see beyond my skin, straight to my hidden insecurities. She wore an ivory-colored raw linen tunic that reached her ankles, braided leather sandals that looked handmade, and a carved wooden necklace with a symbol I didn't recognize, a perfect circle with a stylized flame in the center, as if representing a sun or an eternal fire. "Who are you?" I asked, surprised, lowering my cup of oat milk coffee, which was still steaming. the aroma of cinnamon mingling with that of roasted coffee beans. "My name is Alara," she said, extending a hand with short, clean nails, no polish, but silver rings on each finger that jingled softly as she moved. "And I know what you need. It's not empty advice from a therapist. It's not group therapy with strangers. It's true belonging. A place where your pain is shared, not judged." She handed me a thick, recycled paper card, rough in texture, as if it were handmade. On it simply said, "The Golden Light, Healing Community, Cedar Ridge, Forest." There was no physical address, just a phone number written in black ink in elegant calligraphy, and the same symbol from the necklace embossed on it. There was no address, just a phone number that seemed like an invitation to a mystery. Something in me, something broken and hungry for connection, took that card and tucked it into the pocket of my denim jacket, feeling the paper against my skin like a tangible promise. 2 days later, as I walked home from work in a light rain that soaked my broken umbrella and made the streets of Portland glisten with an oily sheen under the neon lights of bars and shops, I called the number. My finger hovered over the call button for a second, hesitating. But the loneliness of that afternoon, a day when I had had to euthanize an old dog with cancer, holding the animal's paw while its owner wept inconsolably, prompted me to press. Ilara answered on the second ring. "Golden Light," she said, her voice warm as a hug across the line. "How can I enlighten you?" I told her who I was, how we had met at the cafe, and asked her what exactly the community was. She explained patiently, describing Cedar Ridge as a private settlement in the woods, a self-sufficient community dedicated to spiritual and emotional harmony, far from the toxic noise of modern society. There were no membership fees, only voluntary contributions of labor and time. "Come visit us," she invited me. "You'll see for yourself." She gave me detailed directions. Exit, Interstate 84 eastbound. Take a dirt road marked by a large stone with a faded red paint symbol of a circle and flame. Follow it 7 miles through dense forest to a wooden gate with the same symbol carved into it. "Call when you're close," she said. "I'll open it for you." I went on a Saturday morning with the sun rising over the green hills of Oregon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that reflected in the puddles on the road wet from the night rain. I drove my old Toyota Corolla, a reliable car but with over 100,000 miles on the odometer, which rattled slightly on the potholes, but got me where I needed to go. The forest was thick and silent, as if the outside world had ceased to exist once I left the paved highway. The branches of the tall pine trees formed a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight into speckled golden rays that danced on the dirt road, creating hypnotic patterns on the windshield. The air grew cooler as I ascended, with the scent of pine resin and damp earth wafting into the car through the half-open windows. It was beautiful, peaceful, as if the forest itself were whispering to me that I had made the right decision. The gate was open, as if they were waiting for me. A chain hung loosely to one side, and the symbol of the circle and flame was carved deeply into the wood, with fresh edges suggesting it was carefully maintained. At the end of the road, the community appeared. It wasn't what I expected. There were no rustic log cabins or community gardens with organic vegetables growing in neat rows. It was a huge Victorian mansion, 3 stories high with pointed towers that rose like accusing fingers toward the cloudy sky, wrought iron balconies adorned with dried vines that twisted like dead snakes, and tall windows with leaded glass that reflected the sunlight in geometric patterns. Surrounding it were several smaller houses, all painted a pristine white that contrasted with the dark green of the forest, with gray slate roofs glistening with recent moisture. There was a large vegetable garden next to it, with rows of tomatoes, lettuce, and herbs growing in fertile soil, a wooden chicken coop with chickens pecking at the ground, and a low red brick building that looked like a workshop or barn, with double doors, locked with a rusty padlock. The air was filled with the smell of freshly turned earth and wood smoke from a fireplace in the main mansion. Alara was waiting for me at the main entrance of the mansion, standing on the wide porch with carved columns, dressed in a white tunic similar to the one she wore in the cafe, but with a gray wool shawl over her shoulders to combat the morning chill. "Welcome, Iara," she said, hugging me tightly, her slim but strong body pressing against mine, smelling of dried lavender and natural soap. "You've come home. Come. I'll show you around." She introduced me to the other members of the community, who gathered on the porch as if summoned by an invisible bell. There were about 20 of them in total, all between the ages of 30 and 50, with serene faces and simple linen and cotton clothing in neutral tones such as beige, gray, and white. They spoke softly with varied accents, some from the East Coast, others from the South, one with a slight British accent, and smiled with their eyes, not their teeth. A subtle gesture that conveyed warmth without effusiveness. They told me they were brothers of the circle, who had left their lives behind to live in truth, abandoning stressful careers in cities like New York, Los Angeles, or Seattle to seek peace in the forest. A woman named Mira, with long braided hair and a faint scar on her cheek that looked like an old burn, told me she had been a corporate lawyer before joining, burned out by a judicial system that favored the rich. A man named Theo, with a trimmed beard and hands stained with dirt from the garden, was a former philosophy professor who had lost faith in academia. They all had similar stories: personal losses, disillusionment with modern society, a search for meaning that had led them to the golden light. "There are no lies here," said a man named Silas, with a thick gray beard and calloused hands for manual labor, his voice resonating with quiet conviction. "Only light. The light that illuminates the shadows of the soul and unites us in harmony." I was given a room in one of the small houses adjacent to the main mansion. It was austere but clean. A single bed with freshly laundered white cotton sheets, a wooden chair by a window overlooking the dense forest where pine trees swayed in the wind, and a built-in closet with empty shelves for my few belongings. There was no mirror in the room, nor in the shared bathroom at the end of the hallway. "Mirrors feed the ego," Ilara explained with a gentle smile, as if it were an obvious fact. "Here we learn to see ourselves through the eyes of others, not through our vanity." During the first few weeks, everything was perfect. Or at least, that's how I perceived it in my state of emotional vulnerability. We ate together in a communal dining room inside the mansion, a spacious hall with long wooden tables and carved benches, where the food was simple but nutritious: oatmeal with fresh fruit from the garden in the mornings, vegetable soups and homemade bread at noon, vegetable stews and salads in the evenings, all prepared in a collective kitchen where we all took turns. We worked in the garden from dawn, feeling the damp earth under our fingernails as we planted carrot and beet seeds, tended the chickens, collecting warm eggs that still smelled of feathers, cleaned the main mansion with rags and natural soap made from forest herbs, polishing the wooden floors until they shone under the filtered light of the leaded windows. In the evenings, we gathered in the main hall for guided meditations led by Ilara, sitting in a circle on hand-woven rugs, with beeswax candles lit in the center, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and sharing our truths, where each of us spoke of our past pains without judgment, only with attentive listening and collective hugs at the end. No one pressured me to reveal more than I wanted to. No one judged me for my tears when I spoke of my mother's death, of the emptiness her absence left like a black hole in my chest. They just accepted me, integrating me into the gentle rhythm of the community, as if I were a missing piece of a puzzle that finally fit. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. The forest around us isolated us from the outside world, its silence broken only by birdsong at dawn or the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the daily routine gave me a purpose that my life in Portland had never had. But the peace in golden light was a carefully constructed illusion, a facade painted with soft colors to hide the deep cracks beneath. And the truth was in the basement, waiting to be discovered. I began to notice small things at first, details that seemed insignificant but accumulated like drops of water in a cracked dam. Like the fact that the children of the community, there were 3 in total, all between the ages of 8 and 12, with pale faces and large eyes that looked at you with a mixture of curiosity and fear, never ate with us in the community dining room. They were always confined to the main mansion, on a spiritual retreat, Ilara would say, with a serene smile when I asked about them, as if it were something normal and beneficial for their development. I saw them from a distance, playing in the back garden with handmade toys made of wood and fabric, but their laughter was scarce, their movements restrained, as if they knew they shouldn't draw too much attention to themselves, or that, on some nights, when the wind blew from the north and carried distant sounds, she heard muffled cries coming from the low brick building at the edge of the forest, the one that looked like a workshop but that no one used during the day. When I asked Silas about it one afternoon while we were working in the garden, turning the soil with metal hose that smelled of rust, he said casually, "It's the winds from the forest. Sometimes they sound like souls in torment, but it's just nature speaking." His explanation sounded poetic, but his eyes drifted away as he said it, and I noticed how his hands gripped the hoe tighter, as if the subject made him uncomfortable. But it wasn't the wind. I knew it deep in my gut, the kind of gut feeling that women learn to listen to from childhood in order to survive in a dangerous world. Then I saw one of the children, a blond boy with messy hair and blue eyes as clear as the summer sky, named Leo, who seemed to be the oldest of the 3, around 12 years old, with fresh bruises on his thin arms, purple marks peeking out from under the short sleeves of his white tunic as he helped collect eggs from the chicken coop on a sunny morning. "Did you fall while playing?" I asked, kneeling in front of him on the damp earth, smelling of feathers and fresh manure, trying to sound casual so as not to scare him. He shook his head slowly but said nothing. His eyes were empty, as if he had learned not to trust adults, not to expect help from anyone, only silence and obedience to avoid further pain. He looked down at the ground, where a hen was pecking at scattered grains, and walked away without a word, his back hunched like a child carrying an invisible weight. That night, during meditation in the main hall, with the circle of brothers sitting on the floor on rugs woven from natural wool that smelled of sheep and vegetable dyes, Ilara spoke of the purification of body and spirit in a hypnotic voice that echoed off the dark wooden walls. "Pain is a wise teacher," she said, her green eyes shining in the light of the candles flickering in the center of the circle, casting long shadows that danced like spirits. "Only through suffering can we transcend the mortal flesh and attain the true light that unites us all." Some brothers nodded solemnly, their faces lit with blind faith. Others closed their eyes as if remembering past pains or anticipating future ones. I felt a chill run down my spine, a cold that did not come from the night air seeping through the poorly sealed windows, but from a deep premonition that something did not fit into this harmony they proclaimed. But I kept quiet. I asked no more questions, because deep down I wanted to believe in this. I wanted the golden light to be my salvation, my escape from the pain of the outside world. I wanted to belong to something greater than my loneliness, so I ignored the signs, the cracks that were slowly opening in the perfect facade, until I couldn't anymore. It was on the full moon in October, when the forest around the community seemed alive, with shadows moving among the trees like silent ghosts, and the night air carried a bitter cold that seeped through the cracks in the houses, making the candles flicker more fiercely in the windows. Ilara called me to her room in the main mansion at sunset, when the sun was sinking behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep purple that were reflected in the puddles of recent rain on the dirt road. "Today is a special day, Yara," she said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her green eyes, now shaded by the twilight coming through the misty window. "You have shown purity of heart in your meditations and in your daily work. You are ready to see the whole truth, to join the core of the circle. She handed me a white tunic of raw linen, identical to the one she wore, soft to the touch but with a smell of fresh starch that indicated it had been washed recently for this occasion. "Put it on," she instructed, "and don't speak during the ritual. Just observe with an open heart. Understanding will come on its own." She led me to the main mansion, where the other brothers had already gathered in the spacious hall, forming a perfect circle on the polished wooden floor that creaked under their bare feet. In the center of the circle was an antique wooden table with black candles arranged in a circular pattern, ceramic bowls filled with dried herbs that smelled of sage and burnt rosemary, and a long, silver-bladed knife with a carved bone handle that reflected the light from the wall torches, creating sinister flashes in the shadows. The three children knelt on the floor outside the circle, blindfolded with strips of black cloth and their hands bound with white silk ribbons that contrasted with their pale skin. Leo, the oldest, trembled slightly, his rapid breathing visible in the movement of his thin chest. The girl in the middle, a 10-year-old named Maya, with dark braids, kept her head bowed in submission. And the youngest, an 8-year-old boy named Finn, with freckles on his nose, bit his lower lip to keep from crying. My heart stopped at that moment, a knot of terror forming in my throat like a ball of ice that prevented me from swallowing. What is this?" I whispered, my voice coming out like a broken thread, despite Alara's instruction not to speak. "It's the offering ritual," Alara said, taking my hand with cold, firm fingers and guiding me to a place in the circle. "It is the most sacred act of the circle, the one that unites us with the eternal light." One by one, the children were brought to the center of the circle and then lowered into the basement by Silas and another brother named Jonas, a burly man with tattoos on his arms that resembled the symbols on Alara's necklace. I went down with them, my body moving by inertia as if my legs did not belong to me. The basement was large and cavernous, lit by wall torches that smoldered with the acrid smell of burning resin, casting dancing shadows that stretched like accusing fingers across the raw concrete walls. The floor was cold and uneven concrete, stained with something dark that I didn't want to identify but smelled vaguely of rusty iron and decay, an aroma that stuck to my throat like thick smoke. In the center of the room was a rough wooden cross with worn leather straps at the ends to tie arms and legs, and around it, shelves with glass jars filled with herbs, oils, and tools that looked like they had been taken from a medieval torture chamber. Metal clamps, small knives, wooden sticks, and thin chains. Leo was the first to be tied to the cross, his blindfold removed only when his wrists and ankles were secure, revealing pupils dilated with fear that stared at Alara as if begging for mercy. When he saw the knife in Silas's hand, he began to cry, silent tears at first that turned into muffled sobs. "Please, no," he pleaded, his broken, childlike voice cutting through the air like a knife through cloth. "Mommy, please, Mommy." But his mommy was Alara, who only smiled with a disturbing serenity, as if she were witnessing a baptism rather than a horror. "Your sacrifice will enlighten us, son," she said, her voice echoing in the basement, with an echo that made it seem like it was coming from everywhere. "Your pain will purify our souls." Then they began the ritual. It was not quick. It was not merciful. It was a calculated sequence of abuses that lasted for hours, each act designed to inflict maximum suffering without immediately killing, as if the purpose were to extract every drop of agony possible. First, they touched him with hands that feigned tenderness, but were invasive, exploring his small body with calloused fingers that made him writhe and moan, his pale skin reddening under the unwanted contact. Then one of the brothers, Silas, forced his mouth open, pouring a bitter liquid from a glass jar that smelled of rotten herbs and alcohol, causing Leo to cough and spit, tears mixing with the fluid on his chin. "It's so you won't feel the pain as much," Silas lied, his deep voice contrasting with the cruelty of his actions. But it wasn't true. The liquid wasn't an anesthetic. It was something that kept him conscious, alert, amplifying every sensation as his body weakened. The boy screamed when the knife first grazed his skin, a shallow cut on his arm that left a bright red line of blood dripping to the floor, soaking into the previous dark stains. They didn't kill him right away. They tortured him with precision, small cuts on his arms, chest, legs, each accompanied by a psalm recited by Alara about purification and light. They pulled out his fingernails with cold tweezers, the sound of flesh tearing mixed with his howls, reverberating off the walls. They burned his skin with herbs lit in metal bowls, the smell of singed flesh filling the basement like a pagan sacrifice, the thick smoke making my eyes water, not only from the burning, but from the horror. And between each act of torment, Alara repeated in a monotone voice, "We offer your suffering to the light. Your pain redeems us from our shadows." Some brothers watched with closed eyes, murmuring prayers. Others participated actively, their hands trembling slightly at first, but gaining confidence with each cut, as if the ritual freed them from their own inner demons. I stood frozen in the circle, my body rigid as a statue, unable to move or speak. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run to Leo and free him, but fear kept me rooted to the spot, a deep fear of being next if I interrupted the sacred ritual. When they were done with Leo, they took him down from the cross like a broken rag, his lifeless body bleeding from dozens of wounds, but still breathing with shallow gasps that sounded like a dying animal. Then they brought Maya, the 10-year-old girl with dark braids who always seemed the quietest, and repeated the process with variations, cuts in different patterns, burns in more sensitive places, abuses that made me close my eyes but couldn't block out the sounds of her crying. And finally Finn, the youngest, 8 years old with freckles, whose innocence made each act seem even more monstrous. They did the same thing, each ritual stretching out in time like an eternity of shared suffering. When the ritual ended at dawn, with the children unconscious and blindfolded again, Alara approached me, her blood-stained robe seemingly not bothering her. "You are one of us now," she said, placing a cold hand on my shoulder. "You have seen the truth. Your soul is purified." And I nodded, silent tears streaming down my face, because I was afraid of what would happen if I said no, because I wanted to survive. I returned to my small room in one of the adjacent houses, shaking like a leaf in a storm. Dawn filtered pale light through the curtainless window, illuminating the simple bed where I collapsed, the hard mattress pressing against my back like a reminder of reality. I couldn't sleep that night, or the nights that followed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Leo's eyes begging for mercy, smelled the scent of burning flesh invading my nostrils, heard the muffled moans of Maya and Finn mingling with Alara's recitations. My mind replayed the ritual on a loop, every cut, every mental stitch in my memory, as if I were doomed to relive it forever. The next day, during breakfast in the communal dining room, a hall with long tables where the smell of cooked oatmeal and forest honey tried to mask the subtle stench of blood that I imagined was in the air, the children were back in the main mansion, as if nothing had happened the night before. But they no longer played in the garden with the feigned innocence of before. They did not laugh with childish voices that broke the oppressive silence. They moved like automatons, their eyes lost in the void, their thin bodies covered with long robes that hid their fresh wounds, walking with slow, measured steps as if every movement hurt. No one spoke of the ritual during the day. It was as if it did not exist, as if the nights in the basement were a shared secret, kept under lock and key until the next full moon. The brothers acted normally. Silas pruned the bushes in the garden with sharp shears that reminded me of the ritual knife. Mira prepared herbal teas in the communal kitchen with a serene smile that now seemed sinister to me. Theo led group readings of sacred texts that Alara had written, talking about purification through suffering as if it were a lofty philosophy rather than a justification for cruelty. But they all knew. I could see it in their eyes when they looked at the children, a mixture of distant pity and fanatical conviction, as if they genuinely believed that the pain inflicted was a gift, a path to collective enlightenment. Over the next few weeks, I witnessed more spiritual retreats, daytime sessions where the children were taken to the basement for minor purifications, not as intense as the full moon ritual but equally disturbing. Whippings with willow rods that left red marks on their backs, immersions in ice-cold baths that made them shiver for hours, or confession sessions where Alara forced them to admit to invented sins to justify further punishment. Sometimes the children would disappear for days on end, locked in isolated rooms in the main mansion, and when they returned, they were thinner, with deep circles under their eyes and a ghostly pallor that spoke of hunger and isolation. Finn, the youngest, developed a nervous tic in his left eye, a constant blinking he couldn't control, and Maya stopped talking altogether, communicating only with gestures and downcast eyes. One night, during a storm that lashed the forest with torrential rain and thunder that shook the windows, I saw Alara and Silas burying something in the soft forest soil near the brick building. They were carrying shovels and a large cloth bag that sagged under the weight of its contents. I didn't approach them, hiding behind a tree with wet bark sticking to my clothes, but I knew instinctively that it wasn't trash or compost. It was something or someone that wouldn't be coming back. I didn't approach them. Fear kept me rooted to the spot, a paralyzing fear of being discovered, of being next in the basement. And I kept quiet. I kept participating in the daily routines, planting seeds in the garden with trembling hands, eating silently in the dining room with a knot in my stomach that prevented me from swallowing, sleeping in my austere bed with dreams plagued by screams that woke me up sweating. Every day, I hated myself a little more. I looked at myself in the small mirror in the shared bathroom, one of the few allowed in the community, as most were considered vanity, and saw a stranger, eyes sunken from insomnia, skin pale from lack of direct sunlight, and a permanent expression of guilt that wrinkled my forehead. But I didn't have the strength to leave. The golden light had trapped me not with physical chains, but with my own desperate need to belong, to find purpose in the pain I had carried with me since my mother's death. Alara had convinced me, with her soft words and motherly hugs, that suffering was necessary, that the circle was my new family, that leaving them would be betraying the light, until the day came when I couldn't take it anymore, when the weight of guilt became unbearable, like a stone in my chest that prevented me from breathing. It was December, when winter in Oregon was becoming relentless, with snow falling in thick flakes that covered the forest in a silent white blanket, and the cold seeping through the cracks in the houses, causing breath to condense into visible clouds even indoors. Alara announced another ritual during evening meditation, her voice echoing through the hall with a restrained excitement that made my skin crawl. "Brothers, this full moon is special," she said, standing in the center of the circle, wearing a red robe for the occasion, the color symbolizing the blood of purification. "The light has blessed us with a new offering. Let us prepare to receive it." But this time, something was different, a detail that broke the macabre routine. There was a new child in the community. He was not one of the usual three born or brought to the circle years ago. This one was a stranger, a boy with dark skin and short black hair, with wide, terrified brown eyes that looked at everything with confusion. He was brought in a black van with no visible license plates, parked behind the brick building at dusk, blindfolded with a strip of black cloth, and his mouth gagged with silver duct tape that glistened in the fading light. He was 10 years old at most, dressed in urban clothing, jeans torn at the knees, a Chicago Bulls hoodie, and dirty sneakers, which suggested he had been kidnapped from a nearby city, perhaps Portland or Salem. When I saw him being dragged by Silas and Jonas into the mansion, struggling weakly against their strong hands, my stomach churned with immediate nausea. He wasn't a brother of the circle raised in the doctrine. He was a child kidnapped from the outside world, torn from his normal life to be subjected to the horror of the ritual. And I was going to allow him to be tortured and killed, just like the others. That realization hit me like a bolt of lightning, shattering the illusion that had kept me tied to the circle. I couldn't justify this as spiritual purification. It was kidnapping, torture, murder, real crimes, not mystical rituals. During dinner that night, a simple stew of garden vegetables with homemade bread that tasted like ashes in my mouth, I couldn't eat. I watched Alara, smiling serenely as she spoke of the blessing of the new offering, and felt rage bubbling in my chest. After dinner, as the brothers prepared for the ritual, lighting candles in the living room, setting out the tools in the basement with ritualistic movements that now seemed mechanical and cruel to me, I hid in the shared bathroom of my house, a small space with cracked white tiles and a mirror fogged by constant humidity. I cried silently, hot tears running down my cheeks as I curled up on the cold floor, hugging my knees to my chest. The weight of guilt crushed me. I had seen Leo, Maya, and Finn suffering. I had heard their cries. I had smelled their blood, and I had done nothing. I had rationalized, justified, kept quiet. But this time, with the new child, an innocent kidnapped child who didn't belong in this hell, I couldn't anymore. I made a decision in that dark bathroom, with the distant sound of preparations seeping through the thin walls. I wasn't going to participate. I wasn't going to stay. But I wasn't going to report them right away either, because I knew that if I did, and they found out, they would kill me without hesitation, adding me to their offerings. So I did the only thing I could do at that moment: run away. I waited until all the brothers were gathered in the basement, the ritual beginning with monotonous chants rising like smoke through the ventilation grates. I heard Alara's first words, her voice rising in a psalm about purification through sacrifice, and I knew it was now or never. I left the small house with stealthy steps, the snow crunching under my boots like broken glass, the cold biting my skin through the white robe I still wore. I ran into the forest, away from the clearing lit by the lights of the mansion, into the dense darkness where the pines closed in like a living labyrinth. The forest was a chaos of branches tearing at my clothes, roots tripping me, and snow piling up in my shoes, numbing my feet. I ran without direction, just away, my breath forming white clouds in the icy air, my heart pounding against my ribs. I didn't look back once, afraid that if I did, I would see shadows chasing me, brothers of the circle with torches and knives ready to drag me back to the basement. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing in a snowy clearing where the full moon illuminated everything with a cold silver light. There, shivering with cold and fear, I pulled out my hidden phone, one I had kept secret, since electronic devices were considered poison from the outside world in the community, and dialed 911. But the signal was weak in the woods, and the call dropped before connecting. I got up and kept walking, limping from the pain in my twisted ankles until I found a dirt road that led to a main highway. There, after an hour of walking in the dark, a truck driver picked me up and took me to the nearest police station in Portland. I told them everything: the community, the rituals, the abuse, the murders. I gave precise details about the location, the names of the leaders, descriptions of the children. The police organized a raid that same night. But when they arrived at Cedar Ridge, the mansion was in flames, a roaring inferno consuming everything. There were no survivors. The charred bodies were later identified: Alara, Silas, the other brothers, and the children, all dead. The investigation concluded that it was a mass suicide, a pact to avoid capture. But I know the truth. They did it to silence the witnesses, so that no one would know what was happening in the basement. I stayed in Portland for a few more months, but every night was torture. The nightmares wouldn't stop. Guilt consumed me. I couldn't bear to be an accomplice to something so serious, even if it was by omission. So I sold everything, bought a ticket to Spain, and moved to Madrid. I never considered myself a vulnerable person. At 22, I thought I had the world pretty much figured out, or at least enough to navigate it without stumbling too much. I worked at a coffee shop on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, a place called Bean and Brew, where the aroma of roasted beans and freshly ground espresso clung to my clothes like a second skin, and the days melted into a cycle of wiping sticky tables clean of vanilla syrup, serving lattes with perfect foam, and chatting with regulars who ordered the same thing every morning. My life was quiet and somewhat monotonous, the kind of routine that keeps you afloat but doesn't make you feel alive. Waking up at 5:30 a.m. to the buzz of the alarm on my old phone, showering with hot water that cooled too quickly, putting on worn jeans and a coffee shop t-shirt that smelled like stale coffee, and driving my 1998 Honda Civic through streets wet from Portland's perpetual drizzle to work, where the 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. shift left me exhausted, but with enough money to pay the rent on my one-bedroom apartment in a red brick building that creaked in the wind. The apartment was a precarious refuge, with thin walls that let in the sound of the neighbors, the couple upstairs arguing quietly at night, the dog next door barking at midnight, a sagging sofa where I collapsed with a cheap beer from the corner store, and a kitchen that consisted of a microwave that buzzed like a dying insect, and a leaky sink that marked time with rhythmic plips. Cooking was a rare luxury. Most nights I opted for instant ramen that swelled in a plastic bowl, or pre-packaged turkey sandwiches that tasted like cardboard. Eating in front of the television, flickering with reality shows where ordinary people won fortunes or found love in absurd contests. My weekends were for sleeping late, the sun filtering through threadbare curtains that cast mottled patterns on the worn linoleum floor, or for walks in the nearby woods, where the smell of damp earth and fresh pine cleared my mind. But even there, loneliness followed me like a long shadow, a void in my chest that couldn't be filled with philosophy podcasts or self-help books I bought in secondhand bookstores with yellowed pages and notes from previous readers. It wasn't physical loneliness that gnawed at me. I had a couple of friends from work, like Jake, the barista with dragon tattoos on his arms who shared cigarettes during breaks and told bad jokes about customers, but rather that other, deeper, more corrosive kind, the kind that whispers in your ear that you're disconnected from something essential, from a greater meaning that everyone else seems to understand except you, a purpose that slips through your fingers like dry sand. My parents had died in a car accident when I was 18, a head-on collision on a snowy winter road where ice had betrayed the tires, leaving me alone with an inheritance of debt and an empty apartment that still smelled of their cheap cologne and floral perfume. College had been a failed attempt at normality, studying literature with professors who talked about symbolism in Russian novels, while I scribbled phrases like, "Why am I still here?" in the margins of my notebooks, dropping out of the semester to work in the cafeteria because bills didn't wait for epiphanies. Depression was a constant fog, not the dramatic kind that leaves you in bed, but the subtle kind that makes you ignore calls and postpone plans, accumulating dirty dishes in the sink that smelled of stale food and mold. It was on one of those gray November days, while cleaning the espresso machine with a damp cloth that smelled of sour milk and disinfectant soap, that I met Ilara. She was a woman of disarming calm, perhaps in her 40s, with silver hair pulled back into a loose bun that allowed soft strands to fall over her face, wrinkled by time but illuminated by a serenity that seemed to come from a deep place. She came to the coffee shop several days in a row, always at the same time, around 10 in the morning when the sun filtered weakly through the fogged-up windows, and always ordered the same herbal tea, chamomile with honey that sweetened the steam rising from the cup, sitting at the corner table with a hardcover book that looked old, yellowed pages peeking out from the edge. We began to talk naturally, sharing the trivialities one shares with a friendly stranger who becomes an acquaintance. the rainy Portland weather that drenched the streets and made the puddles reflect blurry neon lights. The latest book she was reading on Eastern spirituality, with titles like The Way of the Naked Soul, or The Weariness of Routine That Made Us Long for Something More. She had a gift for active listening, tilting her head with gray eyes that absorbed every word without judgment, asking questions that were not intrusive but invited deep reflection, such as, "Liam, what makes you feel that your life has meaning?" Or, "What would your childhood self dream of for your present self?" One afternoon, as torrential rain pounded the roof of the cafe like impatient fingers, after one of those conversations that went on longer than usual, she telling me about her youth in hippie communes in the 70s where the smell of incense and burnt grass filled the air, me admitting my feeling of floating without an anchor, she said to me in that silky, soft voice, "Liam, you seem like an old soul, searching for your tribe in a world that has left you adrift. Many of us are lost, but some of us are lucky enough to find a lighthouse that guides us to a safe harbor." He told me about the Circle of Dawn, a small, discreet group of people who gathered to share, meditate, and reconnect with the essence of life far from the deafening noise of the city. A collective that met in a country house an hour from Portland, surrounded by forests where the air smelled of resinous pine and damp earth. She described it as a refuge for kindred spirits, a place where community and personal purpose intertwined like the roots of an ancient tree, with guided meditation sessions under the full moon that lit up the clearing like a silver eye, talking circles where voices rose in harmony, sharing fears and hopes as offerings, and gardening workshops where hands in the black, fertile soil restored a sense of creation. "It's not for everyone," she clarified with a soft smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Only for those who are truly ready to listen to the inner voice that the modern world drowns out with its chaos." The seed of curiosity, watered by my latent loneliness that felt like a dry well in my chest, germinated quickly in the days that followed. Ilara returned to the cafe, bringing borrowed books with pages marked with post-it notes, quoting passages about the union of souls in the cycle of life, and our conversations deepened, touching on topics that resonated with me. The disconnection of modern society with its screens glowing in the dark like hypnotic eyes, the search for meaning in ancient rituals that connected with the earth and the sky. After a few weeks of hesitation, nights in my apartment where the silence was oppressive and the ceiling seemed to close in, I accepted her invitation to an introductory meeting, my heart beating with a mixture of excitement and fear that made my palms sweat. The place was an hour from the city, a large, old, dark wood cottage that creaked in the wind, half hidden among a thick grove of tall pines that whispered secrets with every gust. The gravel road crunching under the tires of my Civic until I parked in a clearing lit by wrought iron lanterns that cast dancing shadows. It didn't seem sinister at all. On the contrary, it exuded a rustic and welcoming peace, with smoke coming out of the chimney that smelled of burning wood and dried herbs, and warm lights filtering through windows with linen curtains that fluttered gently. The people who greeted me at the door were diverse and welcoming, young idealists with long hair and organic cotton clothes that smelled of patchouli, older adults with calm, wisdom-wrinkled eyes wearing loose tunics that flowed like water, all with sincere smiles that reached their eyes and firm but not aggressive handshakes that conveyed genuine warmth. The leader, a man named Silas in his 50s with a neatly trimmed gray beard and blue eyes that shone with a serene intensity, welcomed me with a paternal pat on the shoulder, his voice resonating in the polished wooden hallway like an echo of gentle authority. He spoke of the disconnect of the modern world with its constant notifications buzzing like flies in your ear, of the need to return to the simple and essential, to create real bonds that transcend digital surfaces. He spoke of the true self that we all carry within us, buried under layers of social conditioning that make us forget our connection to the earth and the cosmos, and his words resonated in a hollow place in my soul that I didn't even know I had, a void that was filled with the idea of belonging to something greater than my routine of lattes and pastries. The first few weeks were, as promised, transformative, or so I believed in my initial naivety, a balm for my weary soul that had me returning to the coffee shop with a genuine smile for the first time in months. The meetings consisted of guided meditations in the forest clearing, where the pine needle floor crunched under bare feet, and the fresh air filled our lungs with pure oxygen, talking circles sitting on fallen logs that smelled of resin and damp earth, where we shared fears and hopes with voices rising in harmony like an impromptu choir, gardening workshops where hands in the black fertile soil restored a sense of creation by planting seeds that sprouted green and tenacious, and mindful cooking with local ingredients cooked over crackling campfires, smoke rising in spirals that smelled of sage and burning rosemary. It was a real community. I felt seen and heard for the first time, part of something that made me feel connected, as if the emptiness in my chest was filled with the warmth of candles during nightly meditations where the fire danced in the darkness. I ignored the little oddities that began to seep in like cracks in a perfect facade, the way they sometimes referred to Silas with almost religious devotion, calling him the guardian in reverent whispers during talks, the way the language gradually became more exclusive and laden with terms that only the initiated understood, such as synchronicity, which united souls in an eternal flow, or the purifying void, which cleansed the spirit of modern impurities. I justified it as part of the group's culture, the price to pay for belonging to something that made me feel alive, ignoring the slight discomfort that coiled in my stomach like a sleeping snake. The change was slow and subtle, like the tide receding before a devastating tsunami, a gradual descent that caught me before I could notice the water rising. The philosophical talks about the disconnect of the modern world, with its screens glowing in the dark like hypnotic eyes, and notifications buzzing like irritating flies, began to veer toward darker and more disturbing concepts. Silas talking about the purification necessary to achieve true spiritual enlightenment, that society had weakened us with its moral standards that filled us with physical and spiritual toxins such as stress and materialism. He began to introduce the idea that in order to connect with the primordial life force flowing in our blood and the earth, we had to strip ourselves of all conditioning, including those that dictated what was right or wrong in terms of pain and sacrifice. He called it transcending illusory judgment, in a voice that resonated through the room like a hypnotic mantra. The first night that everything really started to go wrong and the veil of innocence was torn was the night of the primordial bond ceremony, a special gathering announced by distant drums rumbling in the forest like the beating of a giant heart. We were gathered in the great hall of the country house, now stripped of everyday furniture, such as sofas and tables that used to fill the space with warmth, with only a few hand-woven rugs on the polished wooden floor that creaked under bare feet, and candles as the only source of light flickering in wrought iron candlesticks, casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls that smelled of fresh resin and wood smoke. The atmosphere was thick and charged with a palpable anticipation that I didn't quite share, a growing nervousness that coiled in my stomach like a knot of rough rope. Silas, wearing a dark linen tunic I had not seen before, flowing like water around his slender figure, gave a speech about the animal essence we all carry within us, buried under layers of civilization that have made us forget our primal connection to blood and earth, about the vital energy that flows in life and death as an eternal cycle that we must honor in order to transcend. He spoke in a resonant voice that filled the room, his blue eyes shining with a mesmerizing intensity, causing those present to nod in unison as if they were one. They brought a young live deer into the center of the circle, the animal trembling in the hands of two members of the group who held it firmly but without apparent cruelty, its large, terrified brown eyes reflecting the candlelight like wells of pure panic, a mirror of what was beginning to well up inside me like a cold fountain. Two members of the circle, closest to Silas, wearing similar robes that whispered as they moved, held it firmly by its front and hind legs, the soft, warm fur beneath their hands, while Silas recited words in a sing-song, rhythmic tone that sounded like an ancient language, possibly Latin or something invented, words that evoked union and purification. Then, with a long, curved knife with a silver blade that glinted in the flickering light, he cut its throat with terrifying and expert precision, the blade sliding smoothly through the skin and tendons with a wet, dull sound, blood spurting out in hot, dark gushes that splattered the wooden floor and carpets in irregular patterns. The room held its collective breath, a heavy silence broken only by the animal's final gurgle, and the drip-drip of blood forming a red pool that slowly spread like a river of spilled life. Then, one by one, the oldest members of the circle approached with solemn steps, some licking the blood directly from the jet still pulsing from the severed artery, the warm, metallic taste filling their mouths with a moan of ecstasy. Others collecting the blood in ceramic bowls that smelled of damp clay and drinking it with that same expression of perverted, transcendent ecstasy I had seen in the deer moments before, eyes closed in a communion that seemed sacred but filled me with nausea. I watched, frozen in my place in the circle, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat, a drum of panic that drowned out all sound. The act itself was brutal and primitive, warm blood splattering the floor with a coppery smell that mingled with the incense burning in the corners. But what chilled my blood to the last corner of my body was the normality with which everyone accepted it. The fervent, almost hungry reverence on their faces, illuminated by the candles that danced like spirits. Alara, the woman who had brought me here, with her serene smile and gray eyes that now seemed sunk in a trance, drank with her eyes closed in ecstasy, a beatific smile curving her red-stained lips. And when she looked directly at me, her eyes were no longer serene and welcoming. They were lit with a foreign, feverish fire that made me instinctively recoil. "It's life, Liam," she whispered to me afterwards in an aside, her voice a thread of poisoned silk that tangled itself in my mind. "It's the pure essence that connects us all. It purifies the soul of the lies of the outside world." I couldn't participate that night, my stomach churning with nausea that made me double over, the imaginary taste of metallic blood in my mouth, and I excused myself with a forced smile that hurt my facial muscles, saying I didn't feel ready. They justified my refusal as a residue of social conditioning that we had all inherited, a veil of false morality that would dissipate with time and practice, and Silas gave me a paternal pat on the shoulder, his hand warm but heavy as a sentence. That night, for the first time since I'd arrived at the circle, fear settled into my home like a silent and persistent guest that would not easily leave, a weight on my chest that made me breathe shallowly under the sheets of my bunk in the common house, the smell of damp wood and collective sweat filling the room. But it was too late to back out. The ties that bound me to the circle were not only ideological and emotional, woven from deep conversations around campfires, crackling with dry wood, and sparks rising into the starry sky. They were practical and tangible, like the invisible chains of the donations I had made, selling most of my belongings, my old TV that buzzed with science fiction movies, my collection of astronomy books with marked pages and margin notes, even my rusty bicycle that I used to ride to work, and donating my meager savings of $2,000 to the community as a gesture of total commitment, an act that Silas praised as the first step toward true liberation. I had nowhere to go if I left now. My apartment in Portland had been sublet for months to save money, and the job at the coffee shop seemed distant, a memory of a life that no longer fit with the purity the circle promised. I clung to the idea that everything had a higher purpose, that my rejection was just a test of my temporary imperfection, and that with time and guidance, I would understand the beauty in the act of communion I had witnessed, the primal union that Silas described as the bridge between life and eternity. The following nights were a steeper descent into the abyss of what I was beginning to recognize as collective madness, a path paved with good intentions that gradually twisted under the weight of blind devotion. The rituals became more frequent, interspersed with daily meditations that now felt like preparations for something darker, and more intense in their demand for personal surrender. The air in the hall heavy with the smell of burning sandalwood incense that clung to clothes and skin like an invisible veil. Animal blood was only the beginning, an appetizer for the spiritual hunger that Silas stoked with speeches that echoed off the wooden walls like those of an ancient prophet, speaking of the need for shared blood to dissolve the barriers of the individual ego. The philosophical talks about the modern world's disconnection, with its screens glowing in the dark like hypnotic eyes and notifications buzzing like irritating flies in the ear, began to veer toward darker and more disturbing concepts. Silas proclaiming that society had weakened us with its false moral standards that filled us with physical and spiritual toxins, such as chronic stress that tensed our muscles and materialism that tied the spirit to inert objects. He began to introduce the idea that in order to connect with the primordial life force that flowed in the blood and the earth like an eternal river, we had to strip away all conditioning, including that which dictated what was right or wrong in terms of pain and personal sacrifice. He called it transcending illusory judgment in a voice that resonated through the room like a hypnotic and seductive mantra that entangled the mind. The first time the ritual escalated to involve human pain was during a night of purging, a session heralded by distant drums rumbling in the forest like the beating of a giant racing heart. The air in the hall thick with the dense smoke of burning white sage that stung the eyes and made the novices cough. We were gathered in the great hall, now stripped of everyday furnishings, such as plush sofas and wooden tables that used to fill the space with homely warmth. With only a few hand-woven rugs on the polished wooden floor that creaked under bare, sweaty feet, and candles as the only source of light, flickering in wrought iron candlesticks casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls that smelled of fresh resin and crackling wood smoke. The atmosphere was thick and charged with a palpable anticipation that I did not entirely share, a growing nervousness that coiled in my stomach like a knot of rough, coarse rope that tightened with every breath. Silas, wearing a dark black linen robe I had not seen before, flowing like dark water around his thin, ascetic figure, gave a speech about the need for emotional purging to cleanse the spirit of accumulated impurities. That physical pain was the bridge to spiritual ecstasy, a fire that burned away the false to reveal the true. He spoke in a resonant voice that filled the hall like distant thunder, his blue eyes shining with an intensity that mesmerized those present, causing them to nod in unison as if they were one, a collective organism. Two members of the circle closest to Silas, wearing similar robes that whispered as they moved like leaves in the wind, brought a young man to the center, a novice like me who had arrived weeks later. A boy named Theo, with messy blonde hair and blue eyes that were now filled with pure terror as he was stripped of his clothes by efficient hands that tore the fabric with sharp sounds. They tied him to a wooden post in the center of the room, rough hemp ropes biting into his pale, trembling skin, his arms outstretched as in a modern crucifixion, the air heavy with the smell of fresh sweat and fear emanating from his body. Silas recited words in a sing-song, rhythmic tone that sounded like an ancient language, possibly Latin or a dialect invented by the group, words that evoked unity and purification through the fire of pain. Then, with a braided leather whip that whistled as it cut through the air, Silas began the flogging, the first blow landing on Theo's back with a sharp crack that left an immediate red whelp, the sound echoing in the hall like a muffled thunderclap. Theo cried out, a primitive sound that broke into sobs, but Silas continued with methodical rhythm, each lash harder, skin breaking on the fifth impact with a wet snap, blood spurting in rivulets that ran down his back and dripped onto the wooden floor. Forming dark pools that reflected the candlelight, the members of the circle watched in reverent silence, some with hands clasped in prayer, others with eyes closed in ecstasy, the air heavy with the smell of leather and fresh blood mingling with the smoke of sage. When Silas finished, Theo hung limp, muffled sobs escaping his throat, and Silas approached, dipping his fingers in the dripping blood and marking the foreheads of those present with red crosses, a gesture of blessing that drew moans of approval from the group. It was my turn, his stained finger pressing my forehead with warm blood that smelled of iron, and I felt a chill that was not spiritual, but one of pure horror. Yet I clapped along with the others, the sound of palms echoing like a seal on my condemnation. The following weeks were a whirlwind of rituals that escalated in intensity, each designed to break my resistance further. Flagellations became commonplace, not just for novices, but for everyone. Silas explaining that pain was the most honest teacher, a fire that burned away the false to reveal the true, and I participated with lashes that left my back streaked with welts that burned when they touched my clothes, the pain a constant reminder of my progress. Extreme fasts lasted for days, hunger gnawing at my stomach like an internal animal, my body weakening until meditations felt like floating in a void, the world blurred into shades of gray. Emotional purging sessions consisted of circles where we screamed our fears into the darkness, voices breaking into collective sobs that echoed through the forest, pounding cushions until our hands bled, the dull thud releasing rage that Silas channeled toward the Union. The logic was clear and perverse, weaken physical and mental resistance so that the true self, malleable, obedient, void of judgment, would emerge like a butterfly from a broken cocoon. I was a willing hostage at first, clinging to the idea that my horror was proof of my temporary imperfection, that with time and guidance, I would understand the beauty in the act of communion I had witnessed, the primal union that Silas described as the bridge between life and eternity, but fear accumulated like sediment in a murky river. The first time the ritual escalated to involve direct human pain was during a night of purging, a special session heralded by distant drums rumbling through the forest like the beat of a giant racing heart that made the ground vibrate beneath our bare feet, the air in the hall thick with the dense smoke of white sage burned in clay bowls, stinging our eyes and making the novices cough and retch. We were gathered in the large hall of the country house, now stripped of everyday furniture, such as plush sofas with rough fabric and wooden tables that used to fill the space with homely warmth and casual conversation, with only a few hand-woven rugs with geometric patterns crunching under the bare, sweaty feet of the participants, and candles as the only source of light, flickering in wrought iron candlesticks with twisted shapes, casting elongated dancing shadows on the rough log walls that smelled of fresh resin and crackling wood smoke in the fireplace. The atmosphere was thick and charged with a palpable anticipation that I did not entirely share, a growing nervousness that coiled in my stomach like a knot of rough, coarse rope that tightened with every shallow breath I took to calm my racing pulse. Silas, wearing a dark black linen robe I had not seen before, which flowed like dark, viscous water around his thin, ascetic figure, gave a speech about the need for emotional purging to cleanse the spirit of impurities accumulated like toxins in the body, that physical pain was the most honest bridge to spiritual ecstasy, a purifying fire that burned away the false and superficial to reveal the true and eternal at the core of every soul. He spoke in a resonant, hypnotic voice that filled the hall like distant thunder rumbling in the chest, his blue eyes shining with an intensity that mesmerized those present, causing them to nod in unison as if they were one. a collective organism united by faith in his word. 2 members of the circle, closest to Silas, wearing similar robes that whispered as they moved like dry leaves in the wind, brought a young man to the center, a novice like me who had arrived weeks later with eyes full of hope, a boy named Theo with messy blonde hair that fell in sweaty strands and blue eyes that were now filled with pure animal terror as he was stripped of his clothes by efficient, cold hands that tore the fabric of his t-shirt and jeans with sharp tearing sounds that echoed in the silence of the room. They tied him to a thick, rough wooden post in the center of the circle, rough hemp ropes biting into his pale, trembling skin that bristled with the cold of the room, his arms outstretched as in a modern and primitive crucifixion, the air heavy with the smell of fresh sweat and fear emanating from his body like a perfume of panic. Silas recited words in a sing-song, rhythmic tone that sounded like an ancient language, possibly Latin, or a dialect invented by the group for their mysticism. Words that evoked union and purification through the fire of shared pain that united souls in an eternal flow. Then, with a braided leather whip that whistled as it cut through the air with a sharp whistle, Silas began the flogging, the first blow landing on Theo's back with a sharp, resounding crack that left an immediate red and swollen whelp, the sound reverberating in the hall like a contained thunderclap that made the wooden floor vibrate. Theo screamed, a primitive, heart-wrenching sound that broke into muffled, hoarse sobs, his body convulsing against the ropes that bit into his skin. But Silas continued with methodical, deliberate rhythm, each lash harder than the last, skin breaking on the 5th impact with a wet, obscene snap that splattered fine drops of blood onto the floor, spurting in rivulets that ran down his pale back and dripped onto the wooden floor in dark pools that reflected the flickering candlelight like broken mirrors. The members of the circle watched in reverent and collective silence, some with hands clasped in silent prayer, forming a circle of fingers white with tension, others with eyes closed in transcendental and mystical ecstasy, the air heavy with the smell of tanned leather and fresh blood mingling with the smoke of white sage burning in clay bowls that crackled softly. When Silas finished the flogging, Theo hung limply from the ropes, muffled sobs escaping from his torn throat like the moans of a wounded animal, and Silas approached with solemn steps, dipping his fingers in the blood dripping from the open wounds and marking the foreheads of those present with sticky red crosses, a gesture of blessing that caused moans of approval and ecstasy to rise from the group like a low guttural chorus. It was my turn, his fingers stained with warm, sticky blood pressing my forehead with a cross that felt like a mark of ownership, the coppery smell invading my nostrils, and I felt a chill that was not spiritual, but one of pure, visceral horror. But I applauded with the others, the sound of clapping echoing in the hall like a final seal on my self-imposed condemnation, the echo of my hands joining those of the others like a pact with the devil disguised as enlightenment. The following weeks were a whirlwind of rituals that escalated in intensity and demand for personal surrender, each designed to break down my resistance further, like waves eroding a rock until it turned to fine sand. Floggings became commonplace, not only for newbies like Theo, who hung from poles with sobs echoing in the night, but for all members, Silas explaining in speeches that lasted for hours in a voice that hypnotized like a pendulum. That pain was the most honest and pure teacher, a purifying fire that burned away the false and superficial aspects of the ego to reveal the true and eternal at the core of every soul that surrendered. I now participated with lashes that left my back streaked with red welts that burned when they touched the cotton clothing that smelled of sweat and dirt. The pain a constant throbbing reminder of my spiritual progress that Silas praised with pats on the shoulder stained with dried blood. Extreme fasts lasted for days on end, hunger gnawing at my stomach like an internal animal scratching at the walls with invisible claws, my body weakening until meditations in the forest clearing felt like floating in a gray and blurred void. The world reduced to ethereal tones where time expanded and contracted like a defective lung. Emotional purging sessions consisted of circles where we shouted our fears in the darkness of the room, with candles flickering like eyes, voices breaking into collective sobs that echoed in the surrounding forest like a primal wail, punching straw-filled cushions that crunched under our fists until our hands bled with raw knuckles, the dull impact releasing pent-up rage that Silas channeled into the union of the circle, with gestures that looked like blessings, but felt like curses. The logic was clear and perverse in its simplicity, a design that ensnared me like a spider's web, weakening physical resistance with fasts that left the body trembling and the mind clouded by hunger, and mental resistance with floggings that turned pain into a mantra repeated until numbness set in, so that the true self, malleable, obedient, void of moral judgment, would emerge like a butterfly from a broken, bloody cocoon. I was a willing hostage at first, clinging to the idea that my growing horror was proof of my temporary selfish imperfection, that with time and guidance I would understand the beauty in the act of communion I had witnessed in the deer ceremony, the primal union that Silas described as the bridge between ephemeral life and shared eternity. But fear accumulated like sediment in a murky, dark river, a deposit that slowly drowned me. The first time the ritual escalated to involve my direct pain, not as an observer, but as a central participant, was during a night of personal purification, a private session announced only for prepared novices like myself. The air in the room, heavy with the dense smoke of white sage and palo santo, burned in gently crackling clay bowls, stinging my eyes and making my throat dry with every inhalation. We were gathered in a smaller, secluded room in the country house, a space with a compact earthen floor that smelled of dampness and ancient roots, dark wooden walls that absorbed the light from candles placed on the floor in a perfect circle, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits. Silas, in his black robe that absorbed light like a void, gave a speech about the need for individual purification to cleanse the spirit of personal impurities, that self-inflicted pain was the most honest bridge to spiritual ecstasy, a fire that burned away the falsehood of the ego to reveal the truth at the core of every soul that surrendered completely. He spoke in a resonant voice that filled the room like distant but imminent thunder, his blue eyes shining with an intensity that mesmerized those present, causing them to nod in sync as if they were one, a collective organism united by blind faith in his word that felt like an addictive drug. Two members of the circle closest to Silas, wearing similar robes that rustled as they moved like dry leaves in the autumn wind, brought a thick, rough wooden pole carved with symbols resembling ancient runes to the center. The air was heavy with the smell of fresh sweat and fear emanating from the novices like a perfume of collective panic. They chose me first, Silas pointing at me with a finger that seemed to extend from the darkness. "Liam, your turn for the purge. Your spirit cries out for release." They stripped me of my clothes with efficient, cold hands that tore the fabric of my t-shirt and jeans with sharp, tearing sounds that echoed in the room like a prelude to violence, the cold night air biting my exposed skin and raising goosebumps that spread across my arms and legs. They tied me to the post, rough hemp ropes biting into my pale, trembling skin that bristled with the cold of the room, my arms outstretched as in a modern and primitive crucifixion, the rough post scraping my back with every involuntary movement. Silas recited words in a sing-song, rhythmic tone that sounded like an ancient language, possibly Latin or dialect, invented by the group for their dark mysticism, words that evoked union and purification through the fire of shared pain that bound souls together in an eternal bloody flow. Then, with a braided leather whip that whistled as it cut through the air with a sharp, sinister whistle, Silas began the flogging, the first blow landing on my back with a sharp, resounding crack that left an immediate red and swollen whelp, the sound reverberating in the room like a contained thunderclap that made the compact earth floor vibrate. I screamed, a primitive, heart-wrenching sound that broke into muffled, hoarse sobs, my body convulsing against the ropes that bit into my skin with greater force. But Silas continued with methodical and deliberate rhythm, each lash harder than the last, skin breaking on the fifth impact, with a wet, obscene snap that splattered drops of thin blood onto the dirt floor, spurting in rivulets that ran down my pale back and dripped onto the ground in dark puddles that slowly absorbed into the earth like offerings to a forgotten god. The members of the circle watched in reverent and collective silence, some with hands clasped in silent prayer, forming a circle of fingers, white with tension and ecstasy. Others with eyes closed in transcendental and mystical ecstasy that made their faces look like masks of religious ecstasy. The air heavy with the smell of tanned leather and fresh blood mingling with the smoke of white sage, burning in clay bowls that crackled softly in the corners. When Silas finished the flogging, I hung limp from the ropes, muffled sobs escaping my torn throat like the moans of a wounded and broken animal, and Silas approached with solemn, measured steps, dipping his fingers in the blood dripping from my open wounds and marking the foreheads of those present with sticky red crosses that smelled of iron and spilled life. A gesture of blessing that caused moans of approval and ecstasy to rise from the group, like a low, guttural chorus echoing through the surrounding forest. It was my turn at last, his fingers stained with my own warm, sticky blood pressing my forehead with a cross that felt like a mark of eternal ownership, the coppery smell invading my nostrils and making my stomach churn with nausea. And I felt a chill that was not spiritual, but one of pure, visceral horror that froze my blood. But I applauded with the others when they untied me, the sound of clapping echoing in the room like a final seal on my self-imposed and blind condemnation, the echo of my hands joining those of the others like a pact with the devil disguised as enlightenment and community that had seduced me. The following weeks were a whirlwind of rituals that escalated in intensity and demand for absolute personal surrender, each designed to break my resistance further, like waves eroding a rock until it turned into fine, scattered sand. Floggings became commonplace, not only for novices like Theo, who hung from poles with sobs that echoed in the night like the cries of lost souls, but for all members of the circle, Silas explaining in speeches that lasted for hours, his voice hypnotic like an oscillating pendulum, that pain was the most honest and pure teacher in the universe, a purifying fire that burned away the false and superficial aspects of the ego to reveal the true and eternal at the core of every soul that surrendered completely to its embrace. I now participated with lashes that left my back streaked with red, swollen welts that burned when they touched the organic cotton clothing that smelled of sweat and fertile soil, the pain a constant throbbing reminder of my spiritual progress that Silas praised with pats on the shoulder, stained with sticky dried blood that transferred to my skin like a cursed blessing. Extreme fasts lasted for days on end, hunger gnawing at my stomach like an internal animal scratching at the walls with invisible, sharp claws, my body weakening until meditations in the forest clearing felt like floating in a gray, blurred void where the world was reduced to ethereal tones and time expanded and contracted like a defective, tired lung. Emotional purging sessions consisted of circles where we shouted our fears in the darkness of the room with candles flickering like malevolent eyes, voices breaking into collective sobs that echoed in the surrounding forest, like a primal, collective lament that seemed to call out to ancient spirits, punching straw-filled cushions that crunched under our fists until our hands bled with raw knuckles and blisters that burst with clear liquid. The dull impact, releasing pent-up rage that Silas channeled into the union of the circle, with gestures that looked like divine blessings but felt like curses taking root in the soul. The logic was clear and perverse in its manipulative simplicity, an architectural design of horror that trapped me like a spider web woven with threads of false hope, weakening physical resistance with fasts that left the body trembling and the mind clouded by hunger that made the world spin in pastel tones, and the mind with flagellations that turned pain into a mantra repeated until complete numbness, where the body no longer responded with panic but with numb acceptance, so that the true self, malleable, obedient, empty of moral judgment, and full of blind devotion, would emerge like a butterfly from a broken, bloody cocoon dripping ichor. I was a willing hostage at first, clinging to the idea that my growing horror was proof of my temporary, selfish imperfection that would dissipate with faith, that with time and guidance I would understand the beauty in the act of communion I had witnessed in the deer ceremony, the primal union that Silas described as the bridge between ephemeral life and eternity shared in a cycle of blood and rebirth. But fear accumulated like sediment in a murky, dark river, a deposit that slowly drowned me, filling my nights in the communal bunk with insomnia, where the wooden ceiling seemed to close in on me like a coffin lid. The night they made me the center of the ultimate ritual, the one that would force me to cannibalize a corpse and cross the darkest threshold of humanity possible, came a few days after Theo's flogging, on a new moon night where the sky was a starless black void that seemed to swallow the very light of the known world, the surrounding forest whispering with cold, erratic winds that brought the smell of damp earth and rotten leaves as an omen of what was to come. A scent that seeped through the half-open windows of the hall and mingled with the smoke of incense we burned in clay bowls to purify the air, with white sage that stung the eyes and made us cough with dry retching. They did not ask me to sit with the others in the circle of hand-woven rugs with geometric patterns that now seemed to me like symbols of eternal and cursed bonds that could not be broken, where the candles flickered with flames that leaned as if fleeing from the center of imminent and absolute horror. Instead, Silas approached me with slow, deliberate steps that echoed on the polished wooden floor like a slow, ominous war drum marking my end, and with that paternal smile that now seemed to me a twisted, false nightmare mask, hiding sharp teeth and predatory eyes, he said to me, "Liam, your time of total and complete union with the Circle of Dawn has come. It is time for your spirit to be truly purified, for you to share your essence with the eternal family in the most sacred and definitive act of communion. It is time for the cycle to be completed in you, for your flesh to be united with ours in the final communion of life, death, and eternal rebirth." I did not fully understand his words at the time, the fog of extreme fasting leaving my body weak and trembling like a dry leaf, and my mind clouded like a veil of dense, oppressive smoke that blocked any clear or rational thought. But my primal instinct, the one I had buried under layers of indoctrination and blind devotion that had made me ignore the red flags waving like warnings in my clouded mind, screamed inside me with a silent but deafening howl that froze my blood to the last corner of my body and soul that remained. I tried to back away, my bare feet slipping on the woven carpet that felt like quicksand under my sweaty heels, cold with terror. But strong, calloused hands grabbed me from behind, immobilizing me with a brutal, ruthless force that left no room for struggle or escape. Fingers digging into my thin shoulders until they bruised the flesh and sent waves of sharp pain through my arms that made me wince with every breath. They were the same hands that had held the deer weeks before, stained with dried blood and fertile soil, smelling of coppery iron and stale sweat accumulated from previous rituals, and they forcibly led me to the center of the circle, where the wooden floor was covered with a black plastic tarp that crinkled under my feet like a makeshift shroud for the imminent and macabre sacrifice that was to come. The gaze of the others was no longer one of warm and shared camaraderie that I had known at the beginning of my stay in the circle. It was the fixed, hungry gaze of predators at a ritual and profane banquet celebrating flesh and blood, eyes glowing with a feverish and deranged fire that reflected the flickering candles like embers in a primitive and eternal hell that fed on broken souls and broken wills. What happened next is a mosaic of pain and terror that my mind tries to block with thick gray fog, like the smoke of a forest fire that consumes everything in its path. Fragments of memories that emerge like flashes in a recurring and vivid nightmare that wakes me up sweating in the night, each more vivid and detailed than the last, etched into my psyche like knives that do not rust or dull with the passing of time. They stripped me naked with efficient, cold hands that tore the fabric of my organic cotton t-shirt with sharp, tearing sounds that echoed through the room like a prelude to the imminent and calculated violence that awaited me. The cold night air biting my exposed skin and raising goosebumps that spread across my thin arms and trembling legs like a wave of Arctic cold that penetrated to my bones and made my teeth chatter with an audible clack in the silence. Silas held the same curved knife with a silver blade that he had used on the deer weeks ago, the candlelight reflecting off the metal like a river of blood frozen in eternal cursed time, but he did not use it to kill me with a quick, merciful cut that could end the horror once and for all. He began with superficial cuts on my arms, the blade sliding with expert surgical precision across the skin of my left forearm, a thin, controlled slash that opened the epidermis with a sharp sting, like the sting of an enraged and lethal bee. Blood spurting in bright red beads that spread like ink on damp, absorbent paper. The pain a hot, stinging prick that made my body tense in involuntary, desperate spasms that pulled at the ropes that bound me. It moved to my legs, cutting fine lines into my inner thighs, where the skin was most sensitive and thin as paper. The blade tracing whimsical and symbolic patterns that bled streams running down my pale skin and dripping onto the wooden floor in dark puddles that slowly absorbed into the cracks. The coppery smell rising into the air laden with incense and collective sweat like a perfume of spilled and desecrated life that stuck to the throat. Then to my torso, the blade sliding across my bare chest, exposed to the cold, cutting soft curves around my nipples that hardened from the cold and the primal terror that flooded my body like a black tide. Each slash a reminder of my absolute vulnerability, exposed to the group watching in reverent and hungry silence, blood dripping down my abdomen in lines that curved like red rivers on a map of raw, trembling flesh that contracted with each cut. One by one, the members of the circle approached with solemn, reverent steps that echoed through the hall like a macabre, collective pilgrimage celebrating flesh and blood. Some licking the blood directly from my wounds with rough, wet tongues that scraped the open flesh like sandpaper on a fresh, oozing sore. The warm, metallic taste filling their mouths with moans of ecstasy that echoed in the hall like a chorus of damned souls, ecstatic in their absolute desecration. Others collecting the blood in ceramic bowls that smelled of damp clay and ancient earth, and drinking it with that same expression of perverted and transcendental ecstasy that I had seen in the deer moments before, its agonizing and lonely death, their eyes closed in a communion that seemed sacred but filled me with nausea that rose in my throat like bitter, acidic bile that threatened to drown me in its bitterness. The physical pain was sharp and constant, a fire that spread through every nerve, exposed and torn with meticulous precision. But the psychological disgust was a bottomless abyss that swallowed me whole and spat me out in pieces, the feeling of being an object, a source of spiritual sustenance for them. A thing desecrated on an altar of collective madness that fed on my blood like a vampire on lost and broken souls moaning in the darkness. I remember the hands that held me down, preventing any movement with brute force that bruised my muscles and left deep white finger marks on my skin, the sweat from their palms sticking to my skin like a second layer of dirt and possession that could not be washed away. I remember Alara's face stained with my red blood dripping from her chin like primitive and savage war paint, looking at me not with compassion, but with a beatific and ecstatic approval that made her face look like that of a saint in a mystical and dark trance celebrating the fall and union in blood. I remember Silas saying in a voice that resonated like a divine and absolute verdict that allowed no appeal or mercy, "Your pain strengthens us, Liam. Your life merges with ours in the shared blood that unites us in eternity. It is an honor that you accept by surrendering completely to the union of the Circle of Dawn." They beat me then, not with uncontrolled blind rage that explodes in uncontrollable fury, but with a methodical determination that made each fist land on my kidneys or stomach with dull, calculated impacts that expelled the air from my lungs in muffled, desperate gasps that left me breathless and coughing, unable to scream because someone's hand covered my mouth with pressure that bruised my lips and made them bleed with a constant, agonizing sting. They bit me, not to tear flesh to the bone with animalistic, deranged savagery, but to mark me, teeth sinking into shoulders and thighs until they left deep, bloody marks that oozed slow, shiny drops, imprinting their essence on mine, as if my skin were soft, malleable clay for their sadistic collective art that celebrated union in absolute, endless desecration. They tore small pieces of skin from my chest and back with metal tweezers that bit with cold, precise snaps, like the teeth of a calculating predator, the flesh coming off with a wet, tearing sound that made me convulse on the rough wooden post that scraped my back with every desperate movement. And I saw them, with an incredulity that transcended the human and the animal to enter the supernatural and the impossible to accept, chew them with jaws that crunched like dry bones under relentless pressure, swallow them with moans of satisfaction that echoed in the hall like a profane and eternal banquet of damned souls celebrating communion in raw and bleeding flesh. My mind broke at that exact and definitive moment, the world reduced to flashes of pain and horror, repeating in an endless and vicious loop. The imaginary taste of my own flesh in the air thick and stale with smoke and blood, the heat of blood dripping down my torso in rivulets that cooled in the cold air of the room like frozen tears. Silas's eyes shining with absolute deranged triumph as he smeared more blood on my forehead like a reverse, cursed baptism that sealed my fate in the circle forever in a bond of flesh and blood. I stopped fighting, my body hanging limply from the hands that held me with brute, ruthless force that bruised my muscles, and I stopped feeling anything but absolute emptiness, becoming a distant spectator of my own carnage, floating in a limbo of shock and agony where the room blurred into shades of red and black that swirled like a vortex of blood and eternal darkness. I believed that nothing could be worse than that absolute and complete desecration, that the circle of candles and blood had touched the bottom of the human and spiritual abyss that a soul could endure. But I was mistaken in my delirium induced by pain and blood loss that left my head light as cotton. Because the climactic night, the one that would force me to cannibalize a corpse and cross the darkest threshold of humanity possible, came a few days later, when my body was still bleeding from superficial wounds that oozed yellow and greenish pus in the damp darkness of the basement, where I was confined between rituals like a caged animal, and my mind floated in a limbo of dissociation that made me feel like a ghost in my own broken skin, marked by cuts that were slowly becoming infected. My name is Daniel, although I'm not sure if telling you my real name is a good idea. Sometimes I think that if I talk too much, if I give too many clues, someone might find me. And it's not just paranoia. I know what these people are capable of. I've seen it. I've lived through it. What I'm about to tell you is not a ghost story or a morbid invention to pass the time. It's a testimony, a warning. If you're reading this, I want you to understand something from the outset. Cults are not a thing of the past. They are not caricatures from cheap movies with robes and red candles. They are real, current, discreet, and they may be operating in your own city, disguised as support groups, cultural associations, social clubs. They tend to choose neighborhoods where no one asks too many questions, where neighbors don't meddle in each other's lives. There they flourish silently. When people hear satanic cult, they imagine ridiculous rituals with pentagrams drawn on the floor and absurd chants. And yes, they use those symbols, but not because they believe in demons that will come out of hell. They do it because they know that symbols are powerful. Satanism is not about invoking the devil. It is about destroying your will, taking away your ability to decide, putting your entire life in the hands of another. That is the real hell, and once you enter, getting out costs you more than you could ever imagine. I entered because I was 23 years old, I was lost, and I wanted to feel like I belonged to something. That's what they're looking for, people with voids, with open wounds, with loneliness. They sniff out fragility like a predator smells blood. They don't say it at first, of course. First, they show you understanding, human warmth. They make you feel seen, heard, and little by little, you give ground without realizing it. One day, you wake up and it's no longer you who decides what you think, who you talk to, what you do with your body. It's been almost 5 years since I escaped. I say it like that, escaped, because it wasn't a quiet departure. It wasn't that I got tired and left. It was an escape. A flight with the certainty that if they caught me, I probably wouldn't be here to tell the tale. I still dream of the damp corridors of the house where we used to meet, of the metallic smell of dried blood mixed with cheap incense. I still wake up at midnight hearing voices that aren't really there. I'm telling you this because I know there are people falling into the same trap right now. Maybe a boy who feels like no one understands him. A woman who has just lost her family. A man who has no friends and is looking for companionship. They're going to find them, and when they do, it will be too late to recognize the signs. There is nothing supernatural about my story. There are no demons or angels, just ordinary men and women with twisted minds and a knack for manipulation. People who, in their quest for power and control, became monsters in the flesh. And I, for a time, was one of their prey. I am not writing this to provoke morbid curiosity or to revel in the macabre. I am doing it because I need to leave a record. Because if I ever disappear, if someone decides to silence me, I want there to be at least a trace of what I saw. I want it to be clear that these things happen and will continue to happen as long as we keep thinking that it doesn't happen here. This happened here, in a place where no one suspected it. And it could happen where you live. It all started one afternoon in a cafe downtown. I was sitting alone with an open notebook in front of me, pretending to write something important. In reality, I was scribbling disconnected phrases, trying to keep the noise in my head from devouring me. I was 23 years old, aimless, with a job I hated and a couple of increasingly distant friends. At that moment, all I wanted was to feel less invisible. I remember it was a woman who approached me first. Brunette, around 30, with a warm smile. She apologized, saying there was no room, and asked if she could sit with me. I said yes, without thinking much about it. She had the kind of presence that makes you let your guard down, as if you knew her from before. Before long, we were talking about books, music, and how most people seem to be living on autopilot. It was curious, because she seemed to be voicing thoughts that I myself had had but never shared. It wasn't long before she mentioned some friends she met up with from time to time. She didn't present them as a strange group, or a cult, or anything like that. She said they were people who were looking for different ways of looking at life. People who questioned the norms and limits imposed by society. She sold it as a space of freedom, honest conversation, and mutual support. I nodded, fascinated, because deep down I felt she was describing me, someone who wanted to escape the routine and find a purpose. The first meeting was in a normal apartment in a nondescript neighborhood. Nothing stood out. A spacious living room, worn sofas, a couple of lit candles on the table, soft music playing in the background. There were about 10 people, all smiling, welcoming, almost exaggeratedly attentive. They greeted me by name, even though I had only told her. I don't know if I was more impressed that they remembered, or that they seemed to care so much that I was there. That night, there was nothing strange, just long conversations about loneliness, the emptiness left by modern life, how little success means as society understands it. They opened up without reservation. One talked about his abusive childhood, another about how he had lost everything in a divorce. They all shared their wounds, and as I listened to them, I felt that I could show mine too. For the first time in a long time, I dared to talk about my constant feeling of being lost, my fear of the future, the sadness I couldn't shake. I received attention, understanding, even tears from some when I told them the worst. It was like a collective hug. And as I left, they told me I could come back whenever I wanted, that this place was open to me. I didn't realize it at the time, but what they did that night was give me a dose of what I needed most: validation. They designed it with surgical precision. They created a space where I could bare my soul without fear of being judged. It was a hook, and I had already taken the bait. I returned the following week, and the week after that. At first, I felt strange, like a guest, but soon I began to notice that they treated me as part of the group. They would text me during the week, invite me on little outings, ask me how I was feeling. That constant attention made me feel special, seen. It was a stark contrast to the rest of my life, where I barely got a couple of calls a month from scattered friends. One afternoon, as we were chatting after the meeting, one of them said something that stuck with me. "We don't believe in masks here. Society forces us to wear them, but here we can take them off. Outside, no one shows who they really are. We do." At that moment, I was convinced that I had found something unique. A refuge. What I didn't know was that this very idea, "here we are real, outside everything is fake," would be the first stone in the wall they would build around me. An invisible wall that would gradually isolate me from the rest of the world. There were no satanic symbols yet, no dark rituals, nothing that could scare a newcomer. Everything seemed harmless, even healing, and that made it much more dangerous. Because no one joins a cult thinking it's a cult. You join believing you've found a home. After 3 months of attending the meetings, I no longer saw myself as a guest. I was one of them. I had a place on the sofa, a cup of tea that was always saved for me, and even inside jokes that only those of us who attended regularly understood. I'd become part of something. That word, belonging, weighed more than I could recognize at the time. The dynamics of the meetings changed little by little. At first, they were informal chats, but over time they began to include exercises. They weren't called that, of course. They were called games or trust exercises. One consisted of staring into another person's eyes for several minutes without speaking. Another involved telling an embarrassing secret that we would never have shared with anyone. The most disturbing, although I didn't notice it at the time, was taking turns insulting each other while the group watched in silence without intervening. The slogan was, "Break down your ego, strip away the lies you use to protect yourself." I remember once, while a girl named Sophia was talking about her insecurities, someone shouted at her, "You're weak, and you know it. Everything you do is out of fear." She fell silent, trembling, and we all stared at her. No one comforted her. When she finished, in tears, the group leader, a man who called himself Adrian, hugged her and told her that pain was necessary for rebirth. And we all nodded, as if it were true. Adrian appeared later in my story, but even then his presence was undeniable. He didn't talk much, at least not in the early meetings, but when he did, everyone fell silent. He had a calm, firm voice and a charisma that was both chilling and attractive. He presented himself as someone who had traveled, who had studied Eastern philosophies, occultism, psychology. He never said it directly, but he hinted that he knew more than any of us could understand. And the worst part was that he was convincing. He was the one who gradually introduced the topic of awakening, as opposed to social indoctrination. He said that since childhood, our heads had been filled with other people's ideas. Family, religion, morality, work, success. That all of this was an invisible prison designed to keep us docile, and that we had the opportunity to break those chains. It struck a chord with me, because I myself felt that I was living a life that was not my own. I had studied something that did not interest me. I worked for money without feeling any purpose. I maintained empty relationships for fear of being alone. That someone put all that into words, that they told me I could break free from it, was intoxicating. There was no talk of Satanism yet. That word was forbidden at first, but phrases such as true freedom lies in transgression, or to be born again, you must destroy the old were repeated. It sounded poetic, but there was something else behind it. A preparation, a mold into which we were gradually being fitted. The group outings also began to become more intense. It was no longer just coffee or walks. They organized nights in houses far from the city, where the atmosphere was different. Candles, hypnotic music, wine flowing freely, and conversations that always revolved around the same thing: the power of breaking taboos. One night, someone suggested that we try walking naked around the room to remove our social masks. Everyone laughed nervously, but in the end, half of them did it. I didn't participate that time, but the funny thing is that I felt bad for not doing it, as if I had failed the group, as if I had clung to a cowardice that they were overcoming. That feeling of guilt was planted with precision. Every act of resistance was presented as a weakness that had to be transcended. Another technique they used was selective praise. When someone obeyed an order or showed extreme vulnerability, they received applause, hugs, recognition. When someone resisted, the group looked at them with disappointment, in silence, until the discomfort pushed them to give in. It was a game of emotional reward and punishment that worked without us realizing it. During those months, I began to distance myself from my lifelong friends. It wasn't explicit. They simply didn't understand me anymore. They seemed superficial and boring to me. I talked less and less with my family, and every time someone pointed out that I was acting strange, I thought it was them who couldn't understand the truth I was beginning to discover. One afternoon, Adrian said something to me that sounded almost fatherly at the time. Out there, no one will be willing to accept you as you are. Here, they will. But you have to dare to cross the line. If you don't, you'll always stay on the sidelines, watching others move forward. I remained silent, but inside me a mixture of fear and desire was ignited. The idea that there was a beyond that I could access, as long as I dared to give in, kept me awake at night. What I didn't know then was that every small step, every confession, every humiliation endured, every boundary broken, was another chain that bound me to the group. By the time I realized it, I'd already taken too many steps to go back to where I was, and worst of all, I began to want to go further. What at first seemed like a refuge began to turn into a system of control. The transition was so slow that I hardly noticed it. There was no specific day when they told me, "From now on, you belong to us." It was a constant drip, a series of small concessions on my part that, when added up, meant that I no longer had a life outside the group. The isolation began disguised as advice. "Your friends don't understand you," they told me. "Your family loves you, yes, but they want you to be weak, tamed. Here you are free. Do you want to go back to the cage, or do you want to grow?" At first, I laughed at that idea, but over time, every argument with my parents, every awkward silence with my friends, seemed to confirm what the group kept telling me. I felt that no one else really listened to me, only them. So I started skipping family gatherings, leaving messages unanswered, making up excuses not to go out with my old friends. It wasn't that they forbade me to talk to others. It was me who chose to cut ties, convinced that I was choosing my own path. At the same time, the group intensified its dynamics. They were no longer simple trust exercises. They began to be tests. One consisted of staying awake all night, sitting in a circle without speaking, with our eyes fixed on a candle. They said it was training to strengthen the will, to break the chains of comfort. Another test was to spend days with hardly any food, to purify the body and soul. It weakened us physically, but at the same time made us more dependent on the group's approval, because only among them did we find comfort in the midst of exhaustion. Adrian, the leader, became more present in my life. He would call me at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, and tell me that I should reflect on something I had said at the last meeting, or that I should write a text confessing my failings and read it aloud in front of everyone. These kinds of public confessions became regular. We had to bare our minds, acknowledge our flaws, hidden desires, and thoughts that embarrassed us. It was humiliating, but also addictive, because after the pain always came absolution, a hug, a smile, a "you're making progress, brother." What affected me the most were the confrontation exercises. Imagine standing in the center of a circle while 10 people surround you and one by one begin to point out your weaknesses, your fears, your contradictions. They tell you that you are weak, that you lie, that you hide. And even if you want to defend yourself, even if you want to shout that it's not true, in the end you end up believing it, because they're all against you and you're alone. And when you break down, when you cry or lower your head, then they hug you and say, that was the purpose, to take off your mask. Little by little, I stopped trusting my own thoughts. Every decision had to be consulted with the group. If I was offered a new job, I would ask if I should accept it. If I met someone outside, they would ask me for details, analyze whether that person was safe, or if they posed a risk to my process. And I accepted it, because they had convinced me that they knew more about me than I did myself. One of the most disturbing moments came when they asked me to hand over something personal as a symbol of commitment. Not money, not valuable objects, something intimate, something that would embarrass me if it came to light. It could be a written confession, a compromising photo, a secret. They called it the key to freedom, but in reality it was insurance, a weapon to use in case anyone thought of leaving. I handed it over. I wrote in detail about things in my life that I had never told anyone, dark thoughts, past mistakes, even fantasies that I was ashamed to admit. When I put it in their hands, I felt that there was no turning back. From that moment on, my body also became a terrain of control. They pushed us to free ourselves from sexual repression and to participate in dynamics where intimacy was confused with obedience. It wasn't pleasure, it was domination. Those who resisted were labeled slaves to the morals of others. And no one wanted to be labeled, neither did I. So I crossed boundaries I never would have imagined, convinced that I was doing it to grow, when in reality I was being broken. Fear began to creep into me in a subtle way. It wasn't a fear of demons or divine punishment, but of being alone, of being rejected by the only circle that accepted me. They had built a universe where I couldn't exist outside of it. If I left, I would be left without family, without friends, without direction, and with the implicit threat that what I had given up could be used against me. The word cult was never uttered. They called themselves the community. They said there were no hierarchies, that we were all equal, but it was a lie. Adrian decided everything, and we all followed him as if it were inevitable. At that point, I was no longer in it by choice. I was in it because I saw no way out, and I hadn't seen the worst yet. The day I first heard the word ritual within the group, I felt a chill. Until then, everything had been presented as dynamics, trust exercises, games. But Adrian was clear. We are ready to take another step. The masks have already fallen. Now we need to cross the line that separates seekers from true initiates. That step consisted of participating in a ritual. There was nothing supernatural about it, at least not in the literal sense. They didn't talk about summoning demons or magic. The ritual was, according to them, a symbolic representation, an act of breaking with the old. But what mattered was not the symbolism, but what they demanded of us. The first time was in a secluded house, a farm on the outskirts. We arrived at dusk. I remember the dirt road, the dark trees around us, the feeling that if anything happened, no one would be able to hear us. Inside, they had everything ready. Black candles lined up, a circle drawn on the floor with salt and charcoal, a table with wine glasses, and a knife that glinted in the dim light. They made us sit on the floor, in silence. Adrian spoke for almost an hour, in that calm voice that never raised its tone but that forced you to listen to him. He said that society kept us castrated, weak, obedient. That true freedom was achieved by destroying the sacred, by trampling on what morality had taught us to revere. The ritual is not to worship anyone, he said. It is to destroy within us what binds us. The first act consisted of drinking a mixture. It wasn't just wine. The taste was bitter, harsh, and I soon realized there was something else in it. Drugs. They didn't tell us what. The effect came quickly, a kind of euphoria, altered perception, time stretching and shrinking. It served to break down any resistance. Then came the blood. It wasn't from sacrificed animals like in the movies. It was ours. One by one, we had to go to the center, take the knife, and make a shallow cut on our arm or hand. The blood fell into a cup, which was then passed from hand to hand. They said it was a pact, that this mixed blood made us inseparable brothers. I did it, trembling, feeling that I was sealing something I could not escape. The third act was the most disturbing: public humiliation. Each of us had to confess something we considered unconfessable, while the others repeated phrases that diminished us, that reminded us how insignificant we were. You are weak. You are nothing. You are a slave. With the drug still in my system, I ended up confessing things I would never have said in any other context. In the end, when I collapsed in shame, Adrian picked me up off the floor, hugged me, and whispered, "Now you are free." I wasn't, of course. I was more trapped than ever. Over time, the rituals became more extreme. Each new encounter demanded something more. First, it was the cuts and confessions. Then came the physical tests, standing naked in the rain at night, enduring light blows from a belt to strengthen the spirit, spending hours blindfolded while others shouted in our ears. They always said it wasn't punishment, that it was training, that it was to break the chains of weakness. What they were really doing was depersonalizing us. They were turning us into obedient bodies, molded minds. In one of those rituals, I saw something I never forgot. Sophia, the girl who had cried during the confrontation exercises, tied to a chair while everyone shouted insults at her and threw cold water on her. She cried, she begged, but Adrian repeated that it was part of the process. In the end, when she was trembling and broken, they untied her and hugged her as if they had saved her. And she, between sobs, thanked them. That was the moment I realized that something was deeply wrong, but instead of running away, I stayed. Because I had convinced myself that it was necessary, that if I endured long enough, I would eventually achieve the supposed freedom they promised. The satanic symbols began to appear later. They were not presented as worship, but as provocation. The inverted cross is not for praying to the devil, Adrian explained. It is for challenging the sacred, for spitting in the face of the gods who made us slaves. The pentagram, the chants, the black candles. It was all theater designed to make people uncomfortable, to break taboos, and it worked. Every time I saw myself participating in those scenes, I felt myself drifting further and further away from the outside world, that there was no turning back. What began as a support group had become a closed circle of submission, and I was already too deep inside to see it clearly. The worst part was that a part of me was beginning to enjoy it, or at least to confuse the euphoria of surviving each ritual with something akin to freedom. That's the cruelest trap. They convince you that your own pain is a form of growth. What I didn't know yet was that the worst was yet to come, that those initial rituals were just the prelude to much more direct, much more real violence. The subjugation didn't come all at once. Like everything before, it was gradual. Before I knew it, I was no longer in control of my time, my decisions, or even my thoughts. The group had molded me into a reflection of what they wanted me to be. The first obvious change was surveillance. At first, they were suggestions to look out for each other. We had to call each other several times a day, send messages explaining where we were, with whom, and what we planned to do. They disguised it as mutual support, but in reality, it was control. If you took too long to respond, someone would ask you what was going on. If you said you were with a friend outside the group, you would get a call from Adrian, always in a friendly but firm tone. And what does that person give you that we can't give you? Those kinds of questions paralyzed me. Anything I answered sounded like betrayal, so I ended up backtracking. You're right, they don't give me anything. Little by little, I gave up all outside contact. Then came the emotional blackmail. We had to write confessions every week. Thoughts, memories, desires. Those texts were read aloud in front of everyone. It was humiliating, but even worse was the idea that everything was being recorded. I knew they were keeping it. One night, one of the veterans told me clearly, "There's no turning back here, Daniel. If someone leaves, everything they confessed is no longer a secret." It was a threat disguised as a warning, and I understood it perfectly. Money also came into play. They didn't ask for large sums at first, just voluntary contributions for meetings, food, and trips. But it soon became an obligation. If you didn't pay, they made you feel like a parasite. I began to allocate a large part of my salary to the community, and I accepted it because they convinced me that I was investing in my freedom. When I complained, they reminded me that money outside only served to keep me enslaved. Inside, on the other hand, it bought me a place on the path to awakening. Humiliation became routine. Sometimes they made us strip naked and stand for hours while they yelled at us that we were nothing, that we were trash. Other times they forced us to confront each other, insult each other, push each other, until someone ended up crying or begging. Then came the forced reconciliation. Hugs, tears, brotherhood. A cycle of destruction and repair that kept us dependent, hooked on relief after pain. Over time, the sexual dynamics became imposition. It wasn't pleasure, it was obedience. Adrian said that sex was the most powerful weapon to destroy the morality imposed by society. If anyone refused, they were labeled repressive, bound by prejudice. No one wanted to be the weak one, the one who resisted, so we all participated. It was degrading, but within the group, it became normal. And when you went back out onto the street, into the outside world, you felt disconnected, as if you no longer fit in anywhere. Fear set in definitively after a meeting in which a new guy, a certain Marcos, said he didn't feel comfortable. It was the first time I saw Adrian lose his temper. He stood up, stared at him, and said in a low voice, "You think you can come in here, take whatever you want, and leave as if nothing happened?" No one moved. We all looked at the floor. The next day, Marcos didn't come back. I asked about him, and they told me he had decided not to follow the path. But they said it with a cold smile, as if it meant something else. I never found out what happened to him, and the silence surrounding his name made it clear to me that it was better not to insist. I no longer thought about escaping, not because I didn't want to, but because it was inconceivable. I was bound by my secrets, by my shame, by my emotional dependence. And besides, I was afraid. Afraid that they would find me, that they would expose my confessions, that they would do to me what they had done to others. There were nights when I lay awake on the floor of the community house, staring at the shadows on the wall. I listened to the others breathing, some crying silently, others murmuring feverish dreams. And I thought, this can't be my life. But at dawn, with Adrian singing and the group's fake hugs, I convinced myself again that yes, this was the only place I belonged. That was the real subjugation, not the physical chains, but the idea that there was no other world outside those walls. And at that point, it was no longer necessary to watch me too closely. I was my own jailer. Until that moment, I could still convince myself that everything that happened within the community had a purpose. The pain, the humiliation, the submission. I told myself that these were steps in a process, trials to reach a freedom that I could not yet comprehend. But all that collapsed the day I saw, with my own eyes, how far they were willing to go. It was with Laura. She had been in the group longer than me, maybe 2 years, and had always been one of the most committed. She participated in everything without hesitation, smiled even after the hardest rituals, and repeated Adrian's words like an echo. But one day she began to show signs of exhaustion. She was pale, thinner, her dark circles were deep. And although she tried to hide it, you could tell she was tired. One night during a meeting, Adrian asked her directly, "Are you with us or not?" Laura hesitated. That pause was enough for everything to fall apart. "I'm tired," she said at last, in a faint voice. "I need to rest." Anywhere else, that sentence would have been nothing special. But there, in the middle of that room, filled with candles and expectant silence, it was like blasphemy. No one said anything at first. Then Adrian slowly got up and walked toward her. He stared at her without raising his voice. Tiredness doesn't exist. Only the resistance of your ego exists. And if you don't destroy it, it will destroy us all. He turned to us and said, "What do we do with someone who clings to their weakness?" I don't know who said it first, but someone whispered, "We have to help her break." And then it began. They sat her down on a chair in the middle of the room. They tied her hands to the armrests. She cried, she begged, but no one moved to stop it. Neither did I. We had become silent accomplices, obedient spectators. At first, it was insults. They shouted in her face, calling her weak, a parasite, a traitor. Then came the shoving, the slapping. Adrian didn't intervene. He watched, arms crossed, like a judge letting his executioners do their work. When she tried to get up, one of the men punched her hard in the stomach. Laura doubled over in pain, barely able to breathe. And then Adrian leaned over her and whispered something I will never forget. "Pain is love, and we love you too much to let you go." They beat her for almost an hour. It wasn't a brutal beating like in a street fight. It was more cruel, more calculated. Each blow was measured so as not to knock her unconscious, to prolong the suffering. Between attacks, they forced her to repeat phrases like, "I am nothing," or "My body does not belong to me." When she got it wrong, she received a harder blow. I was sitting in the circle, my heart racing, wishing for it all to end, but unable to get up. I couldn't. The fear of becoming the next one paralyzed me. And I think that was the real goal, not just to punish Laura, but to remind us all what would happen if we hesitated. When they finally let her go, she was devastated, bleeding from her nose, her eyes swollen, trembling. She fell to the ground, and Adrian hugged her, as if he were a father comforting his daughter. He stroked her hair and said, "Now you are free." She was sobbing, barely able to speak. But the most disturbing thing was what happened next. Some people came over and hugged her too, crying with her, telling her they loved her. And Laura, broken, was grateful. Grateful. As if in the midst of hell, that hug was all she had left. I didn't sleep that night. The sound of the blows, the screams, Laura's empty gaze were engraved in my mind. I kept telling myself that I had to leave, that this was madness. But at the same time, a voice in my head told me, if you try to escape, the same thing will happen to you, or worse. And then I understood. It wasn't about faith or philosophy. or freedom. It was fear. The whole group functioned on the basis of fear. Love, brotherhood, hugs after punishment were just the other side of the coin, a perfect balance between terror and comfort designed to keep us tied down. In the weeks that followed, I saw more scenes like that. Not always as violent, but just as disturbing. Sleep deprivation, confinement in dark rooms, screaming sessions until someone broke down. And each time the group would come together afterwards to heal the victim, closing the circle. Pain and relief, punishment and love. I began to notice something in myself, a kind of emotional anesthesia. At first I was horrified to see the violence. Then I got used to it. And then the worst. One day I participated. I was one of those who yelled, who insulted, who pushed, not because I wanted to, but because the fear of being singled out pushed me to do it. That was my lowest point, realizing that I was no longer just a victim, but also a perpetrator. From then on, I understood that I couldn't go on much longer, but I also knew that leaving wasn't easy. I had seen what they did to those who hesitated. I had felt the weight of blackmail, of my secret confessions. Escaping was almost impossible, but I began to think about it, even if only silently, even if only as a whisper in my head. That whisper became an obsession after what I saw in the next ritual. It was such a brutal scene that it forced me to make the decision to flee, even if it meant risking my life. I always thought that what happened to Laura was the worst I could see. I was wrong. A few relatively quiet weeks passed, which in that place meant that there were no public punishments or overly intense humiliation sessions. We devoted ourselves to community service, distributing pamphlets with ambiguous phrases, selling products to finance the group, and cleaning the house. Adrian was calm, almost paternal, as if he wanted to reward us for our obedience. That calmness deceived me. It made me let my guard down. Everything changed one Saturday night. We were called to a special meeting. It wasn't in the main house, but in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. I remember the journey. The van we were traveling in, the smell of gasoline, the absolute silence. No one asked any questions. No one dared. When we entered, the first thing I saw was Marcos. Yes, the boy who had disappeared weeks ago. He was there, sitting in a chair, his hands tied behind his back and his head bowed. His face was gaunt, as if he had aged 10 years in a month. I knew at that moment that he had never left of his own free will. Adrian was standing behind him, with that unsettling calm he always showed before something important. "Brothers," he said, "tonight we are going to learn a necessary lesson. Marcos tried to betray us. He thought he could run away with information that compromises us. He thought he could return to the world of the sleeping and talk about us. He walked among us, looking each of us in the eye. What do we do with traitors?" There was a thick silence until someone replied, almost fearfully, "They are purged." Adrian smiled. "Exactly. Purification is necessary to keep us strong." What followed was one of the most horrible scenes of my life. They beat him in front of us, but this time not with the intention of correcting him as they had done with Laura. It was different. It was an exemplary punishment, a message. Marcos screamed, begging them to leave him alone, that he wouldn't say anything. No one listened. Every time someone hesitated to participate, Adrian pointed at them. "You do it. Prove your loyalty." I myself received that order. They put a stick in my hands and I had to hit him in the ribs. I felt the crack under the wood. I heard his muffled scream. And the worst thing was that in the midst of my horror, a thought flashed through my mind. Thank God it's not me. That idea would haunt me later, like poison. When he was barely moving, Adrian lifted him up by his hair and forced us to look at him. This is what happens when someone forgets who we are, when someone thinks they are more important than the community. Marcos was crying. He could barely hold his head up. And then Adrian, in the softest voice I had ever heard him use, said, "Now tell your brothers what you have learned." Marcos tried to speak, but only a murmur came out. Someone interpreted it as, "I'm sorry." Adrian hugged him, as he always did after punishments, and whispered in his ear. Then they left him lying on the ground, unconscious. I never saw him again. Never. No one ever mentioned him again either. I didn't sleep that night. My hands were shaking, my knuckles still sore from the blow I had been forced to deliver, and inside me something broke. Until then, I had believed that perhaps the group was just a strange delusion, a macabre game of power and control. But now I understood that we were facing something worse, an organization capable of making people disappear. The fear that always paralyzed me was mixed with another emotion, desperate rage. I had seen too much. I could no longer tell myself that everything had a purpose. It was a lie. It was just violence, control, submission. And by staying there, I was already an accomplice. In the days that followed, I moved around like a ghost. I hardly spoke. I didn't smile. I barely ate. But in my head, a plan was beginning to take shape. Very basic, very clumsy, to run away. I didn't know how, or when, or where, but I knew that if I didn't do it soon, I would end up like Marcos. I began to notice details that I had previously overlooked. Who had the keys to the house? Which windows were left ajar when there was less surveillance? Because yes, they were no longer mutual caregivers. There was real surveillance, shifts of members, who made sure that no one entered or left without permission. I kept quiet, but my mind was racing. I knew that if anyone suspected me, I was lost. So I continued to participate in the rituals, pretended to be obedient, recited the phrases, hugged the others. And all the while, inside, I repeated a single word: escape. The fracture was already there. It was invisible to them, but irreversible for me. And what happened at the next meeting gave me the final push to try, even if it meant risking my life. I don't know how much time passed between that night with Marcos and my decision to escape. Maybe a week, maybe two. Within the group, time was diluted. There were no clocks, no normal routines, just a succession of rituals, tasks, and silences. All I know is that every day I felt closer to my end. I made my decision one morning, lying on the floor of the communal house, surrounded by bodies breathing heavily. Some were crying in their sleep. I stared at the ceiling and thought of Marcos, of Laura, of my own hands beating him on Adrian's orders. I thought that sooner or later it would be me who ended up in that chair, and I realized that I would rather die trying to escape than rot there. The plan was ridiculously simple. Climb out one of the second-floor windows overlooking the back alley. I had seen that the latch was loose and that the fence surrounding the house had a low spot where I could jump over. There was no room for further strategy. If I thought too much, I would never do it. I spent 3 days preparing my mind. I pretended to be normal. I participated in the meetings, recited the phrases, smiled when I was supposed to. Meanwhile, I hid a crumpled 20-euro bill in an inside pocket of my jacket, the only money I had managed to keep from the money they forced me to hand over. That would be my salvation or my doom. The opportunity came on a Friday night. We had finished an exhausting ritual, and the guards seemed less attentive than usual. Fatigue was overcoming them. I waited for the murmur of breathing to fill the room, and then I stood up, my heart about to burst out of my chest. Each step toward the staircase felt like thunder. I expected someone to open their eyes, for Adrian to appear out of nowhere, but nothing happened. I reached the second floor, opened the window with a blood-curdling squeak, and slid outside. The cold, early morning air hit my face, and for a moment I felt such violent freedom that I wanted to cry. I jumped. I fell awkwardly, scraping my hands and knee, but I didn't stop. I ran to the fence, climbed over as best I could, and threw myself to the other side. From there, I only remember running and running without looking back, my lungs burning and my mind repeating, "Don't stop. Don't stop." I reached the highway. The loneliness of the asphalt at night was terrifying, and liberating at the same time. I didn't know where to go, so I kept walking, barefoot now because I had lost my shoes in the fall. Every car that passed seemed dangerous to me. What if it was them? What if Adrian had sent someone to look for me? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I found an open gas station. I staggered inside, covered in dust and blood. The employee looked at me as if I were crazy. I asked him for a glass of water and inquired about the first bus to the city. I paid with my $20 bill and sat on the floor, waiting, shivering with cold and fear. When I finally got on the bus, I sat in the back seat, with my back against the window, watching each passenger as if I could be one of them. No one was chasing me, or at least, that's what I told myself. But the fear had already sunk in so deeply that every glance seemed like a threat. I arrived in the city at dawn. I had nowhere to go. My family was far away, and I hadn't spoken to them in too long. I didn't want to go back to my friends. I was ashamed of what I had done, of what I had allowed to happen. I ended up in a homeless shelter, where I spent the first few nights. I slept little, always with one eye open, convinced that at any moment Adrian would appear and drag me back. The first few days were a nightmare. I couldn't be in enclosed spaces. Every door seemed like a trap. I couldn't stand crowds either. Every unfamiliar face was a potential spy. I had panic attacks, cold sweats, memories that repeated themselves over and over again. And the worst thing was the guilt of having participated, of having hit him, of having kept quiet. Once I even came close to going back. I walked to the bus station and stared at the timetables to the village. Adrian's voice echoed in my head. "Your family's here. Outside there's only emptiness." But something stronger held me back. The image of Marcos, bleeding, begging. That saved me from going back. Little by little, with the help of a social worker, I managed to stabilize myself. He convinced me to go to therapy, even though the words came out in fragments. I tried to explain what I had experienced, but it sounded so incredible that sometimes I myself doubted whether it had really happened. The psychologist told me it was normal, that the mind tries to protect itself by denying reality. I never reported it. I couldn't. What was I going to say? That I belonged to a satanic cult that beat and disappeared people? Who would believe me? And even if they did, what evidence did I have? They were experts at covering their tracks. All I had were my memories, and those were already destroying me. Escaping was my liberation, but also the beginning of another prison, that of permanent fear. Sometimes I still dream about the house, about Adrian's voice, about the screams during the rituals. I wake up drenched in sweat, certain that someone is watching me. And even though I know that I'm no longer there physically, mentally, I'm still their prisoner. Escaping saved my life, but it didn't give me back my peace. Years have passed since I managed to escape. I am not the same person who joined that group out of curiosity and a desire to belong. Nor am I exactly the one who fled, trembling, with bloodied hands and eyes wide with fear. I'm something else, a mixture of both, a survivor with invisible scars that no one can see but which weigh more heavily than any physical wound. Life on the outside was not the salvation I had hoped for. At first, I thought it would be enough to put some distance between myself and my past, to move to another city, to forget. But I soon discovered that the chains were not just walls, closed doors, or guards on duty. The chains were internal. I distrusted everyone. A kind gesture on the street seemed like a trap to me. A conversation with a stranger became a veiled threat. The hugs from my family, when I finally dared to visit them, seemed suspicious to me. I could no longer interpret affection without thinking that there was manipulation behind it. That's what hurt me the most. The poison had contaminated the way I saw people. The nights were the worst. I dreamed of the rituals, the chants, Adrian's eyes shining in the darkness. I dreamed of Laura, Marcos, all those who were trapped. I would wake up gasping, convinced they would come back for me. For years, I slept with a chair blocking my bedroom door, even though I knew that probably no one was looking for me anymore. Fear had become a habit. Therapy helped, although it didn't cure me. I learned to put words to what happened to me. Manipulation, coercion, psychological violence, physical abuse. I learned that I wasn't weak for falling, that anyone can do so under the right circumstances. It was hard for me to accept that. There is still a part of me that hates myself for staying so long, for participating, for hitting people when I was ordered to. The psychologist tells me it's survival, that I had no choice at the time. But I remember it differently. I remember the stick in my hands, the sound of bone breaking. No one can take that away from me. The hardest thing is that out there, no one talks about these things. When I say the word cult, people imagine robes, pentagrams, paranormal stories from cheap movies. But the reality is quieter, more mundane, and therefore more dangerous. There were no demons, no ghosts, just flesh and blood people who knew how to manipulate, who understood how to break others in order to dominate them. And it worked. God, how it worked. The worst part is that they could be anywhere. That's the idea that terrifies me the most. A facade of cultural community, a self-help group, a spiritual circle on social media. That's how they start. They talk to you about freedom, about breaking chains, about discovering who you really are. And little by little, they isolate you. They suck your energy, your money, your will, until one day you realize that you no longer have your own identity. You are a reflection of what they want. I write this as a warning, not to seek pity or to exorcise my ghosts. I know those will stay with me until the end, but to put it on record, so that someone, reading these words, can recognize the signs in time. If one day you are offered a place where you will be free, as long as you cut ties with your family, surrender your secrets, or renounce your outside connections, run. If one day someone tells you that pain is love, that humiliation is a test, that fear is necessary for growth, run. And if you ever find yourself thinking that only in that group are you someone and that there is nothing outside, then you are already trapped. I survived. Others were not so lucky. I still dream of Marcos, his face covered in blood, his broken voice begging to be left alone. I dream of Laura, thanking them for the beatings, because she had nothing else left to be thankful for. I dream about all those who are still there, convinced that they are waking up, when in reality, they are sinking deeper every day. Sometimes, I wonder if Adrian is still alive, if the group still exists, if they recruit others like me in some remote village. The idea torments me, but at the same time, it reminds me why I am writing this. Because if he is still out there, I don't want him to have any more silent victims. I never reported it. I never could. But today I'm writing. Perhaps this is my way of reporting it. Even if it is late, even if no one names names or addresses, my testimony is all I have. And if anyone reading this feels a knot in their stomach, if they recognize some of these dynamics in their own life, if they suspect they are in something similar, take it as a sign. Leave now. Don't wait until it's too late. I managed to escape. But I swear to you, even though my feet are free, a part of me never left that house. I never thought something like this could happen to me. I wasn't naive. I wasn't a directionless teenager. And I certainly wasn't someone looking for trouble. I had a stable job, a few friends, and a boring but secure routine. Maybe that was the problem, the routine. It all started one afternoon in a bar downtown. I had left work and stopped in for a beer. The place was half empty, the music was too loud, and the bartender was bored. At the table next to me was a group of 3 people, 2 men and a woman, talking quietly, but laughing among themselves as if they were sharing a secret. At one point, the woman turned and smiled at me. It wasn't a flirtatious smile. It was more like a knowing smile. After a while, one of the men asked me the time. From there, we started talking. They were friendly, intelligent, and talked about profound topics: freedom, society, the emptiness of modern life, the falseness of relationships. I nodded because they said things that resonated with my own boredom. The one who talked the most was named Adrian. He was in his 30s, with well-combed black hair, dark eyes, and a soft but firm voice. "Have you ever felt like all this is a sham?" he said, pointing to the street through the bar window. "Working, paying bills, waiting for the weekend, getting a little drunk, and starting all over again." "All the time," I replied without thinking. They looked at each other and smiled, as if they had gotten what they were hoping for. Adrian put his hand on my shoulder. "Then you should come with us." He didn't say it as an invitation, but as a statement. I asked him where. The woman, whose name was Clara, interjected, "A place where you'll understand that you're not alone. A place where people have already awakened." They gave me an address, an old house on the outskirts of town. "Come tomorrow night, if you want. It's not mandatory." But they said it with such certainty that I knew if I didn't go, I would spend days wondering what I had missed. Curiosity got the better of me. The next night, I took the bus to the outskirts and walked the 2 blocks between the bus stop and the address they had given me. It was a large house with peeling paint and windows covered by dark curtains. There was no sign or anything to identify it. I knocked on the door, and a young man, maybe 20 years old, opened it with a nervous smile. He led me into a large room lit only by candles. There were about 10 people sitting in a circle. In the center, Adrian stood dressed in black. When he saw me, he opened his arms as if he had been waiting for me. "Welcome, brother." I sat down in the circle. No one looked at me with suspicion. On the contrary, they all smiled at me as if they already knew me. There were people of all ages, a couple of teenagers, a man in his 50s, several young women. The atmosphere was warm, but strange, too welcoming, almost artificial. Adrian began to speak. There were no religious speeches or obvious symbols, but the theme was clear. The outside world is rotten, full of slaves. Only here can we recover our essence. There are no rules, no guilt, only the truth of each person. They asked me about myself, what I did, what I thought about life, what frustrated me. Everyone listened attentively, nodded, agreed with me. It was the first time in a long time that someone had made me feel so important. Then they brought food, bread, wine, cheese, all placed on the floor in the center of the circle. We ate together, sharing with our hands, as if we were an improvised family. At one point, Clara whispered in my ear, "This is just the beginning. No one here is going to judge you." We spent hours like this. Laughter, confidences, enigmatic phrases from Adrian that the others repeated like mantras. I was bewildered, but also fascinated. There was nothing overtly strange, but there was something in the air. A tension I couldn't explain, a dense energy that kept me alert. When I left, around midnight, Adrian walked me to the door. "Don't tell anyone you were here," he said, without losing his smile. "Not because we have anything to hide, but because the world wouldn't understand." I nodded, even though I found it a strange thing to say. "Come back whenever you want. You have a place here now." That night, I had trouble sleeping. There was something about the way he spoke that scared me, but at the same time attracted me. It was like a magnet, and deep down, I kept telling myself that there was nothing wrong with coming back. They were just people sharing ideas and food. What could be wrong with that? I didn't know yet that that first step was the beginning of a tunnel from which I almost didn't make it out alive. I returned to the house 2 days later. I didn't think too much about it. It was as if a voice inside me was telling me that I had to be there, that if I didn't go back, I would miss something important. The house was fuller than the first time. There were about 20 of us, spread out on old sofas, mismatched chairs, and cushions on the floor. There was soft music, the smell of incense, and a feeling of intimacy that contrasted with the outside world. They offered me tea, homemade bread, and fruit. Everything had that improvised communal feel, as if they were simple people sharing what little they had. Adrian was at the center, as always. He didn't need to introduce himself as the leader. Everyone revolved around him, attentive to his every gesture, every word. He had the ability to speak without shouting and still fill the silence. "There are no hierarchies here," he said that night. "We are all equal, but some of us have been here longer and have more clarity. Society is built on lies, invisible chains. We come here to break them." I nodded, without questioning. So did the people around me. No one interrupted him, no one challenged him. There was something hypnotic about his speech. He spoke of freedom, but every word sounded like an order. Then the introductions began. One by one, the newcomers had to say what had brought them there. Some talked about feeling lonely, others about not being able to stand their jobs, others about wanting to find a purpose. When it was my turn, I said I was tired of feeling empty, of always repeating the same thing. Everyone applauded softly, as if I had said something brave. Clara took my hand and smiled at me. "You've already taken the first step." What struck me most was the warmth of the group. There was always someone willing to listen to you, to hug you, to tell you they understood what you were going through. They talked about brotherhood and family. I, who had been estranged from my friends for months and hardly saw my family, began to believe it. Here were people who really seemed to care about me. The meetings followed a pattern. First, Adrian's talks, always full of profound-sounding phrases. To live, you have to die. Society fears what it cannot control. Guilt is the heaviest chain. Then, group dynamics, games, confessions, little rituals of trust. Once they blindfolded us and made us walk around the house holding hands, assuring us that we had to learn to trust in the darkness. Another time they made us share personal secrets, one after another, until someone ended up crying. I thought it was all part of a psychological exercise, an alternative method of therapy. No one mentioned religion directly, let alone Satanism. It was more subtle. They talked about breaking with what had been imposed on us, about rejecting the morals that had been instilled in us since childhood. Good and evil are inventions, Adrian said. Only will exists. Those who impose limits want to control you. I started going 2 or 3 times a week. I stopped hanging out with my old friends because I found them boring. Every time I told them something about the house, they reacted with skepticism. A friend said to me, "That sounds like a cult, be careful." I laughed. For me, at that moment, they were the only ones who understood me. One detail began to bother me, although I pushed it out of my mind. Discretion. We never talked about the group outside the house. If anyone asked, we were to say it was a meditation circle, nothing more. We had to leave our phones in a box when we entered. There were no photos, no records. Everything had to remain in our memories like a shared secret. In exchange for that obedience, they made me feel special. Adrian sought me out at meetings, asked me questions, and used me as an example when he wanted to illustrate a point. Clara offered me constant companionship, as if she had become my personal guide, and the others treated me like a brother who had just returned home after years of being lost. There were nights that ended with everyone sitting on the floor, holding hands, eyes closed, murmuring phrases that sounded like inverted psalms. They weren't traditional prayers. They spoke of strength, of breaking chains, of blood and will. I repeated the words without analyzing them too much. Once I asked, "What exactly is this group?" Adrian looked at me intently and replied, "You'll know when you're ready." Then he changed the subject. And I didn't insist. The more time I spent there, the harder it was for me to imagine my life without them. Outside, everything was gray. The mechanical work, the superficial conversations, the empty stares on public transportation. Inside, on the other hand, there was intensity, excitement, a purpose. The group began to occupy every space in my life. I no longer spent my weekends at home, but at theirs, sleeping on mattresses on the floor alongside others. I woke up to the smell of incense, to voices whispering mantras, to the certainty that I belonged to something bigger. What I didn't understand then was that this warmth was a hook, a carefully designed trap. The human warmth I so desperately needed was also the net that was beginning to close in around me. And although there were moments when a voice in my head told me that something wasn't right, the secrets, the control, the overly perfect phrases, that same voice was drowned out by a stronger one. Adrian's, the group's, that addictive feeling of belonging. That's how I stopped seeing them as strangers and started calling them, without realizing it, my real family. By the third week of attending regularly, I was no longer a visitor. I was part of the circle. They made that clear. One night, after the meeting, Adrian took me aside. We were in the kitchen. The light was yellowish, and there were leftover bread and glasses of cheap wine on the table. "Daniel," he said, "you're no longer a guest, you're one of us." He didn't say it solemnly, but it shook me. He had that ability. With a simple phrase, he could make something ordinary feel momentous. From that day on, things changed. Clara started spending more time with me. She would sit next to me in the circle, brush my hand, whisper in my ear during the activities. One night, after one of those confessional sessions, she asked me to accompany her to the roof. We climbed up in silence. The air was cold, the street deserted, and the house looked like a dark block isolated from the rest of the world. "No one judges you here," she said, looking at me intently. "What you desire, what you fear, what you would never say outside, here you can let it all out." She kissed me without waiting for a response. It was direct, invasive. I didn't have time to think. Then she said, "This isn't for me or for you. It's for trust, so you understand that the bonds here are different." That sentence baffled me, but at the same time, it convinced me. It was true. Nothing there worked like it did on the outside. Everything was more intense, more immediate. The tests began shortly after. Small things at first. One night, they asked us to share our most embarrassing secret out loud. Everyone did it. Stories of theft, infidelity, violent thoughts. I resisted, but Clara looked at me with pleading eyes. I ended up talking about something I had never confessed to anyone, a humiliating childhood memory. Everyone nodded. Some hugged me. Adrian congratulated me. Shame is a shackle. Today you freed yourself from one. Later I understood that it wasn't liberation, it was blackmail material. Another test was more concrete. We had to spend an entire night in the house, without sleeping, writing down everything we hated about our lives. They called it burning the past. At dawn, we gathered the sheets of paper and burned them in the courtyard, around a circle of stones. As the flames consumed the paper, Adrian said, "There are no more chains. Now you belong to something greater." I felt euphoric, as if I had truly left something behind, but as I left there, on my way home, my eyes red from exhaustion and the smell of smoke on my clothes, I was overcome by a strange emptiness, as if I had given up something I could never get back. The pressure from the group became more evident. They asked me every day what I was doing, who I was with. If I said I had seen someone from outside, they would put on serious faces and warn me, "Those people won't understand. They'll contaminate you." I began to isolate myself. My friends stopped calling me because I always made excuses. My family began to worry, but I avoided them. Every time I thought about them, I remembered Adrian's words. Blood means nothing. The real family is the one you choose. The next step was physical. One night, after another one of those community dinners, they turned off all the lights and lit only candles. Adrian spoke of the need to break taboos. He said that the body was a prison when we filled it with guilt. Then Clara and another woman stood up, slowly took off their clothes in front of everyone and knelt beside him. No one said anything. I stood still, uncomfortable, but the others applauded softly, as if witnessing it were an honor. "There's no shame here. Adrian repeated. What we do is pure because it is not tainted by outside morality. Then they invited others to undress. Some did so without hesitation, others shyly. When it was my turn, I felt all eyes on me. My first reaction was to refuse, but Clara whispered to me, "It's not what you think. Trust me." And I ended up giving in. The feeling of being exposed pierced me like a knife, but they celebrated. They hugged me, applauded me, told me I had taken another step toward freedom. That word, freedom, was repeated so often that I no longer knew what it meant. Adrian had a special talent for turning things around. What would be humiliating on the outside was purification on the inside. What would be manipulation on the outside was trust on the inside. What would be abuse on the outside was a gift on the inside. And we all accepted it because we were all looking for the same thing, a place where we could stop feeling alone. I no longer saw Adrian as just another man. He was someone with answers, someone who seemed to read my thoughts. When he spoke, I felt like he was speaking directly to me. And when he praised me in public, I experienced a mixture of pride and submission that I had never felt toward anyone else. What I didn't understand then was that this was the real seduction. Not the sex, not the hugs, not Clara's looks. It was the way they convinced me that whatever they asked of me was for my own good. And so, little by little, I stopped asking myself what I wanted. The only question that mattered to me was what the group wanted from me. The dispossession was not immediate. At first, it seemed like I was making the decisions myself. I stopped seeing my friends because they had nothing to offer me. I avoided my family because they didn't understand me. I gave up my free time because I wanted to be with my new family. It all sounded voluntary, but the truth is that every step was carefully guided. One afternoon, after a meeting, Adrian called me into the back room. The room was almost empty. Just a table, 2 chairs, and an open notebook with his neat handwriting. He offered me a seat across from him. "Tell me, Daniel, how do you feel when you think about your life outside?" I thought about it for a few seconds. "Tired," I said. "I feel like it no longer belongs to me." He smiled with satisfaction, as if I had given the right answer. "Exactly. That's no longer yours. If you want to keep moving forward, you have to let go of what still ties you down." He didn't specify what that meant, but I soon understood. First, it was personal belongings. One night, we were asked to bring something valuable, something that represented our past. I brought a watch that had belonged to my grandfather. We put it in a box along with the other items: photos, jewelry, letters, small heirlooms. Adrian closed the box and said, "These memories are chains. Today we break them." The box never reappeared. No one asked about it. Next was money. Adrian said that money was the most perverse tool of the system, but that, ironically, it was also necessary to survive in it. So we all had to contribute what we could. It wasn't mandatory, but those who didn't do so were singled out with uncomfortable looks and silences. I started by leaving bills in a jar. Then it was part of my salary. One day, Clara accompanied me to the ATM and made me withdraw almost everything I had in my account. "Don't think of it as a loss," she said as she put the cash in an envelope. "It's an investment in yourself." Then it was my relationships. I stopped answering calls. I ignored messages from friends. When my mother visited me at home because I hadn't responded for days, I told her I was fine, that I was busy, not to worry. But she saw that I was acting strange, suspicious. That same night, I told the group about it, and Adrian looked at me seriously. "Blood family is the first chain. They are the guardians of the system. They want to drag you back into slavery." I nodded, even though I felt a twinge inside. But every time I had doubts, I remembered the nights at the house, the dim lights, the feeling of belonging, the hugs, the knowing glances. Outside, I had nothing like that. The psychological deprivation was the cruelest. We had to write confessions in notebooks, thoughts, fantasies, sins. Adrian said it was an exercise in liberation. but we knew that the notebooks remained under his control. One night, during group reading, a boy tried to refuse to share what he had written. Adrian took him by the arm, forced him to stand up, and read his pages aloud. The boy cried, begging him to stop, but Adrian did so calmly, without raising his voice. At the end, he said, "See, this is what binds us, the fear of being seen as we are. There is no room for lies here." We all applauded softly. The boy was trembling. From then on, every word I wrote was a condemnation. I knew that if I ever tried to leave, they had enough to destroy me. The dynamics became harsher. Sometimes they kept us standing for hours, without speaking, staring at a fixed point on the wall. If anyone moved, they were labeled as weak. Other times they pitted us against each other with insults, one-on-one, spitting out whatever hurt the most until the other broke down in tears. Then we had to hug each other, ask for forgiveness, rebuild the brotherhood. It was a calculated cycle. Destroy and rebuild, destroy and rebuild. I slept less and less at home. I ended up taking clothes to the community and staying there for several days at a time. The mattresses on the floor, the windows always covered, the candles lit, the nighttime chants. When I woke up, there were no clocks, no news, nothing to remind me of the real world. It was like living in suspended time. Clara was always nearby. She talked to me about the importance of giving oneself over without reserve. Sometimes she would climb into my bed in the middle of the night, caress me, and whisper in my ear, "You are no longer an outsider. You are one of us." I believed her. I wanted to believe her, because I had already lost too much to turn back. The most disturbing thing was that each renunciation made me feel a strange relief, as if letting go of everything freed me from an invisible burden. I didn't see that, in reality, I was emptying myself. I was running out of anything that belonged to me. That was the real dispossession, dismantling myself little by little until all that remained was a version molded by them. The first time I saw a clear symbol was on a Friday night. We had spent hours in group dynamics, writing and sharing painful memories. The air was thick with incense smoke and sweat. Adrian asked us to turn off all the lights and form a circle in the room. In the center, he placed a low table covered with a black cloth. On it was a glass of wine, a knife, and a red candle. No one explained anything. Everyone was silent, as if they knew what was coming next. I looked around, waiting for some indication. Adrian stood behind the table and spoke in a firm voice. "The world out there is dead. It feeds us lies. It numbs us. Here we celebrate the only truth, willpower." He took off his shirt and made a shallow cut in his forearm with the knife. He let the blood fall into the cup of wine. Then he raised it. "This is the pact that unites us, blood and will." The cup was passed from hand to hand. Everyone drank. When it was my turn, I hesitated. Clara squeezed my arm and whispered, "Trust." I drank. The metallic taste turned my stomach, but I didn't show it. The others smiled. Then came the most disturbing part. One by one, we had to approach the center and kneel in front of Adrian. He would place his hand on our heads and say, "Here you die to the world. Here you are reborn for us." Some cried, others laughed nervously. I felt a chill run down my spine, but also a strange sense of belonging. It was as if I had crossed an invisible line. It wasn't the only ritual. Over time, they became more elaborate. Sometimes they took us to the basement of the house. It was a small space with damp cement walls, lit only by candles. There they painted symbols on the floor with red chalk. Pentagrams, circles, letters I didn't recognize. There were no conventional religious images, but there were phrases engraved on the walls. Pain liberates. Willpower rules. There is no sin, only weakness. In these rituals, they made us shout insults against what our previous life represented. Family, work, religion, society. It was cathartic, but also heartbreaking. I felt like pieces of myself were being torn away. One night, They asked us to bring photos or letters from important people outside. I brought a photo with my mother from years ago. They made us put everything in the center of the circle and then burned it. The fire lit up our faces as Adrian repeated, "They are no longer part of you, only us." I watched as the photo twisted in the flames, and it hurt, but everyone around me was applauding, and I forced myself to smile. Another ritual consisted of fasting for 2 days. Then, at dawn, they took us to the countryside, on the outskirts of town. The air was freezing, the grass damp. They made us walk barefoot to a clearing. There, naked, we had to remain silent while Adrian talked about renouncing fear and modesty. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Those of us who resisted were embraced, as if we had reached a higher level. The degradation was disguised as spirituality. Everything had an apparent purpose, to free us from our chains, to strengthen us, to bring us closer to the group. But in reality, it was obedience. Every time we gave in to something that was humiliating or painful, the wall of resistance weakened a little more. The most disturbing thing was when the rituals began to include controlled violence. Once, during an exercise, Adrian asked us to take turns slapping the person in front of us. At first, I thought it was a joke, but it wasn't. The slaps were real, hard. The goal, he said, was to learn to accept pain without rebelling and to inflict it without guilt. I hit a skinny guy who barely looked up. When it was my turn to receive, I felt my skin burning and the others laughing. At the end, Adrian hugged us all and said, "Today we are freer than yesterday." I began to notice changes in myself. My body was tired, marked by bruises and small cuts. My mind felt clouded, unable to think outside of his words. Outside, in my daily life, everything became distant. My coworkers asked me if I was okay because I looked exhausted and distracted. I said yes, even though inside I knew I was no longer the same. The group had become the center of everything. The rituals, as horrible as they were, gave me a feeling of intensity that nothing else could offer me. It was like a drug. It was destroying me, but I couldn't quit. And deep down, even though I still didn't admit it, I began to suspect that the worst was yet to come. The change was almost imperceptible at first. The rituals ceased to be exceptions and became routine. It was no longer just on Fridays. They began to summon us during the week, sometimes in the early hours of the morning, with a simple phone call. We had to be available at all times. Someone would say to me, "Adrian needs you right now," and I would drop whatever I was doing. My phone would ring at 3 in the morning, and without thinking, I would get out of bed and walk to their house. I never asked why. It was like a conditioned reflex. One of the first things they did was demand confessions. It was about telling everything you had done, even the most intimate and shameful things. They gathered us in a circle, and each of us had to reveal something personal. Small secrets weren't enough. If you tried to get out of it, Adrian insisted until you dug up something painful. I talked about my broken relationship, my anger toward my father, the suicidal thoughts I had had as a teenager. They listened in silence, and when I finished, they applauded and hugged me, as if I had done something heroic. But I later understood that these confessions were not a release, but a weapon. Everything was recorded. If you hesitated or wanted to leave, they could remind you of what you had said. Once, a new boy wanted to leave. Adrian took him aside and in front of everyone, repeated his own confessions, word for word. The boy turned pale and ended up crying, begging to stay. In addition to confessions, there was surveillance. They paired us up. Each member had a guardian who had to report their movements. Clara was my guardian at first. She wrote to me every day to find out where I was, who I was with, what I was thinking. If I took too long to reply, she got upset. If I mentioned someone from outside, she would say, "Why are you wasting your energy on them? This is where it matters." Soon, I found myself censoring myself. I avoided going out with coworkers because I knew I would have to explain myself. If I talked to my mother, I made up excuses so she wouldn't notice how much I had changed. It was easier to isolate myself. There were also tests of loyalty. They asked us for money. At first, it was small contributions for candles, wine, food. Then they started asking for larger sums under the pretext of investing in the community. I handed over part of my salary without protest. When I hesitated, Adrian would stare at me and say, "Would you rather your money continue to feed the rotten system? Here it becomes strength." There was no way to refuse. Another test was obeying absurd orders, like spending an entire night awake writing phrases like, "There is no I, only us," or going out barefoot to walk around the city and coming back with stones from the street. They were meaningless tasks, but they served their purpose, to destroy resistance and prove that you no longer thought for yourself. The most disturbing part came when they started controlling our relationships within the group. Adrian decided who you could talk to more, who you could hug, even who you could sleep with. He said that desire was a powerful weapon that should be used to strengthen the community, not to distract it. I remember one night when he took me aside and said, "You and Clara have too much of a connection. It weakens you. Starting today, you will talk more with Diego. Clara has another role." He said it as if it were a simple change of tasks. I nodded, even though inside I felt something breaking. But I didn't protest. I no longer protested about anything. The indoctrination became physical. They began to use sleep deprivation as punishment. If you made a mistake, they made you stay awake all night, sitting on the floor without moving. Once, a boy fell asleep. 2 members picked him up and beat him until his nose bled. Then they hugged him, as if it were training. I myself spent entire nights with my eyes open, fighting sleep, repeating the phrases they forced us to memorize. Pain liberates me. The community is my family. There is nothing outside. After several of those nights, I began to believe them. The most disturbing thing was how you became an accomplice. Adrian no longer needed to shout. We ourselves kept an eye on the others. If anyone hesitated, we pointed them out. If anyone showed weakness, we reprimanded them. We became each other's jailers. I, who at first felt like a victim, ended up encouraging others to obey. I remember saying, "Don't resist. It's for your own good." And the worst part is that I said it with conviction. Over time, I stopped distinguishing where I ended and the group began. My clothes changed, as did my words. I repeated phrases that weren't mine. My family barely recognized me when they saw me, but I no longer thought about them. They were part of another life. Submission wasn't just obedience. It was total surrender. You had no right to your time, your money, your body, or your thoughts. Everything belonged to them. And without realizing it, they no longer needed chains to hold me. The prison was inside me. Until then, I thought the worst thing was the humiliation, the sleepless nights, the hunger, or the absurd rituals. But I hadn't yet seen what happened when someone decided to truly disobey. It was a winter night, one of the coldest. Adrian summoned us to the basement. The air smelled of dampness and melted wax. The circle was already drawn on the floor, larger than usual, and a metal chair had been placed in the center. When we were all gathered, they brought Marcos in. He was one of the newest members. 2 older members had brought him in, one on each side, holding him tightly by the arms. His face was red, his eyes swollen. You could tell he had been crying. Adrian explained calmly. Marcos doubted us. He tried to leave without permission. We can't allow that. Marcos began to beg. He said he was confused, that he just needed time to think. Adrian looked at him as if he were a silly child. "No one leaves," he replied. "No one breaks the circle." They tied him to the chair with leather straps. His wrists were instantly marked. The silence in the room was so heavy that it was hard to breathe. Adrian took out a notebook and began to read the confessions Marcos had made weeks earlier. Intimate details of his childhood, his fears, his relationships. He read slowly, in an almost affectionate tone, but every word was like a knife. Marcos lowered his head, ashamed, trembling. "This is what you gave us, Marcos," said Adrian. "You gave it to us because you trusted us. Now you want to betray that trust. That is an offense against everyone." No one moved. No one dared to look at each other. Then came the order. "Today we will learn what discipline means." 2 members approached with a bucket of ice water and threw it on him. Marcos screamed. The water soaked his clothes and he began to shiver. Then one of them punched him hard in the stomach. Marcos doubled over, but the straps held him in place. Adrian made us take turns. Each of us had to mark Marcos in some way. A slap, a punch, an insult to his face. He said that this way we shared the responsibility, that this way the community was strengthened. When it was my turn, my throat closed up. Marcos looked at me with desperate eyes, as if asking for help. I raised my hand and hit him, barely grazing his cheek. Adrian frowned. "Harder, or you'll prove you don't belong here." I had no choice. I did it harder. I felt the warm skin of his face under my palm, and the sharp sound echoed in my head long after I sat down. The others did the same, some with obvious cruelty. Marcos was left with a swollen face and bleeding lips. When he was done, Adrian leaned over him and whispered, "Do you still want to leave?" Marcos shook his head, sobbing. They untied him and dropped him to the floor. No one helped him up. He crawled into a corner and stayed there, trembling, like a wounded animal. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his gaze, but at the same time, part of me felt relief. Relief that I wasn't the one being punished, that I had fulfilled my role. After that, Marcos changed. He became quieter, more obedient. He never talked about leaving again. He was an empty shell who followed orders without resistance. Adrian used him as an example. This is how true loyalty is forged. The punishment was not an isolated incident. There were others. A girl, Lucia, was caught secretly writing to her sister. They forced her to read the letter aloud, word for word, in front of everyone. Then Adrian ordered her to burn it. And when she resisted, 3 of them held her down and shaved her head right there, while she screamed. When they were done, Adrian ran his hand over her shaved head and said, "Now you're truly ours." I watched everything and felt nauseous, but also paralyzed with fear. I knew that one wrong move, one wrong word, and it would be me in the metal chair or under the scissors. Punishment became the sect's most effective tool. They didn't need to threaten us constantly. It was enough to remind us of what we had seen. Violence was always present, floating in the air, ready to fall on anyone. The worst thing was the silence that followed each session. No one commented on what had happened. We went home, pretending everything was normal, and in that silence grew the certainty that there was no way out. I had entered a game where the rules were made to break you, and the price of failure was too high. I don't know how they managed to convince us, but there came a point when the abnormal became routine. What would have seemed inconceivable to me before, I now accepted as part of the process. However, nothing had prepared me for what they called the night of surrender. We were summoned to the basement, but this time the atmosphere was different. The walls were covered with black cloth, and in the center, they had placed a long, rough wooden table. On top of it were lit red candles, knives, chains, and a metal mask that looked like it came from another era. The air was thick with smoke, mixed with the metallic smell of hot iron. Adrian entered dressed in a dark robe. The others followed him in silence, forming a circle around him. His voice echoed in the darkness. "Tonight we will strip ourselves of what still binds us to weakness. Each of us will take a step beyond fear." They brought Marcos, him again. I don't know if they chose him because he was already broken or because they knew he wouldn't resist too much. He came in with his head down, his wrists tied. He said nothing, not even when they placed him on the table. His breathing was rapid, like that of a trapped animal. Adrian explained that it was a sacrifice, but not in the literal sense. No one was going to die, according to him. It was a symbolic sacrifice, an act to seal our total surrender. But the tone with which he said it left no room for relief. He ordered us to approach one by one. The first had to mark Marcos's skin with the knife, not to kill him, but to draw the symbol of the community on his flesh. The second had to pour wine and salt on the wound. The third had to kiss it. And so it went, in a cycle of pain, humiliation, and obedience. When it was my turn, I felt my hands shaking. The knife was cold and heavy. Marcos looked at me sideways, resigned, without asking for help. I didn't want to do it, but everyone was watching me. Adrian held my wrist tightly and whispered, "There's no turning back." So I pressed the blade against Marcos's arm and made a shallow cut. It wasn't deep, but it was enough for the blood to flow. My eyes burned, as if it were me who had been cut. Then I poured the wine, the salt, and finally kissed the wet, salty, warm wound. I could taste it on my tongue for hours. The ritual continued. Some did it fervently, almost excitedly. Others, like me, did it with trembling hands. Marcos didn't cry. He remained silent, hardened. Perhaps he was already beyond pain. The final act was the worst. Adrian approached with the metal mask. It was a kind of muzzle with spikes on the inside. He placed it on Marcos's face and tightened the straps. Marcos let out a muffled groan, a guttural sound that made my skin crawl. The mask hurt his cheeks and mouth. Adrian raised his arms. "This is the sacrifice. We don't need to kill to prove our power. It's enough to destroy what remains of the resistance." When they removed the mask, Marcos was bleeding from the mouth. He could barely breathe. Adrian embraced him like a beloved son, staining his tunic red. "Today you are reborn, brother." They left him lying on the floor, exhausted, bleeding. No one dared to help him. Adrian made us swear to silence. What happened in that room must never be mentioned outside. That night, I returned home with my whole body shaking. I got in the shower and scrubbed my skin until it was red, trying to wash away the smell of blood and wine. But nothing could remove it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcos's mouth, the mask, the cut I had made myself. Something broke inside me. Until then, I had managed to convince myself that it was all a process of liberation, that enduring pain made me stronger. But what I witnessed that night was not liberation. It was ritualized torture, a way of crushing us into pieces without will. The most terrifying thing was realizing that no one rebelled. We all accepted it, as if it were natural, including me. I'd crossed the line. And from that moment on, I began to think, very secretly, about how to escape. After the night of the symbolic sacrifice, something changed in me. I could no longer justify what was happening there. What I had previously called liberation, I now saw as absolute control and terror. However, escaping was not easy. Every move you made was watched. Every word could be traced. Every friend in the group could report to Adrian if they suspected anything. I began to observe the patterns. The house, the schedules, the dynamics. I discovered that there were surveillance shifts. Someone was always nearby, checking who came in or out. Clara was constantly with me, but not as a friend, as a supervisor. If I was away from her for a few minutes, her eyes would always reappear. The paranoia was constant. Once I tried to hide a message for my mother in a book from the house library. Before I finished writing it, Clara appeared behind me with the calm smile that now sent shivers down my spine. "What are you doing, Daniel?" I didn't say anything. She just looked at me for a moment and left. But I understood that I couldn't trust anyone. There were no allies. Despite that, I began to plan my escape. I needed a moment when the members were distracted, some oversight. I knew that if Adrian suspected anything, there would be severe consequences. I remembered the nights of punishment, the slaps, Marcos's humiliation. I remembered the mask, the blood, the forced obedience. All of that pushed me to leave, but it also paralyzed me with fear. I waited for weeks. I observed how the tasks and surveillance rotated. I discovered that on weekends, When there were more complex rituals, some members were caught up in the preparations, which left certain corners less guarded. Finally, the opportunity arrived. It was a Friday. We had spent the entire afternoon preparing for the ritual, and several members were in the basement arranging the symbols and decorations. Adrian and Clara were busy arguing about the placement of the candles and knives. I had my things hidden in a corner, some clothes, my backpack, my phone. I approached the back door, which was always less guarded. I opened it slowly, listening to every sound, feeling my heart race. It was cold outside. The street was deserted. I felt fear and relief at the same time. Fear of being caught, relief at having my first real chance to escape. I ran without looking back. Every shadow seemed like a threat. Every sound was a possible warning that Adrian had seen me. I reached the first bus stop and got on with trembling hands. As I drove away, I could see the silhouette of the house in the distance, lit by candles. I felt a relief that was both heartbreaking and overwhelming. I was leaving my life, my friends, my routine behind, and yet it was the only thing I could do to survive. When I got home, I locked the door and leaned against it. I was shaking, sweating, feeling nauseous. My body was exhausted, my mind saturated. I checked my phone, messages from friends, missed calls, old photos. It all seemed like another life. I hardly slept that night. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like a member of the group that had come to find me. The fear did not go away. Even outside the cult, I was trapped in the psychological control they had exerted for months. For days, I moved from place to place, unable to return to my routine. I didn't trust anyone. Every noise in the street made me look over my shoulder. Sometimes, I could still hear Adrian's voice whispering in my head. There's no turning back. But the hardest part wasn't physically escaping. It was mentally escaping from them. The memories of nights of rituals, humiliation, and violence were still present. The symbolic sacrifice, the beatings, the confessions, all of that was a weight I carried with me. I learned that it's not easy to break away from someone who has stripped you of everything: trust, identity, freedom. Every day outside the cult was a silent battle against fear, against guilt, against the feeling that everyone could be watching me. However, surviving meant just that: moving, watching out, being suspicious, rebuilding myself. What I had experienced had marked me irreversibly, and I knew I would never be the same person again. I escaped, yes, but the scars weren't just physical. They were in my mind, in every memory, in every reflection of myself that I saw. And the worst part was the certainty that if I hadn't been so cautious, if I had hesitated for a second, I might not be telling you this now.